is the origin of the Raine Study from 1989 onwards. And the origin really began in our ultrasound department. In the 1980s, ultrasound imaging of the fetus had really come of age. And this shows the equipment that we were using at this time, including our brand new placental blood flow Doppler equipment at the back, which is now very outdated. But the measurements that we were introducing at that time have stood the test of time, which means that those measurements we did 30 years later are very similar to the measurements we do today. But most importantly, we did a study of 500 women where we called them in 5 extra times during pregnancy to see how these blood flow studies and our imaging studies would work. And this was the original publication of that in the American Journal in 1990. So we knew we could do these studies, and we knew women would flock to the department to have them done. So that then led to this grant application to the National Health and Medical Research Council, which was funded in 1988 or so. And this was to study placental blood flow during pregnancy. And it was written by myself and Dr. Stan Reed, who was the superintendent of our hospital at the time and had an interest in ultrasound. So we knew we had the funding to do the ultrasound studies, but that was all that grant funded us for. I just thought I'd show you this. This is the budget for that grant application written in 1987. And you can, just to show what we were very excited about, we were going to buy a new computer. It was a brand new IBM personal computer. It was very large. It was going to cost $13,600 to buy this computer, but we'd be able to store data in it. We couldn't be able to store much. We'd have to put that onto tapes, but we could certainly enter the data with this computer. Now look at the cost of a research midwife. So for half a year, research midwife cost $12,000, which was less than the cost of the computer. So you can see that midwives become more expensive, and as they should, and computers have become much, much cheaper. But that just goes to show how much times have changed. And then in 1988, the Raine Foundation put out a call for a grand idea. And this had come from the money left from Mary Raine. She was originally Mary Carter, and she had died in 1960. She arrived with very little money from England in the earliest part of the last century, worked very, very hard, was very austere, but built up a massive financial empire. She was Perth's original entrepreneur, and by 1960 owned a lot of the hotel businesses in Perth. She died and left her whole estate to the University of Western Australia because she got married when she was late. She married Joe Raine, a farmer from Merredin, and they didn't have any children, of course. This is them on their wedding day. She left her entire estate to the University of Western Australia to investigate the origins of disease in humans. That money was originally spent on the Busselton study to investigate the origins of disease starting in adult life, which is what the Busselton study has done. And the idea that we had was to study the origins of disease starting from early and fetal life, which at that time was a very grand idea. So this was then, we were then awarded a major grant from the Raine Research Foundation, which met with their original brief of supporting research seeking the diagnosis and investigation of the nature and origin of human disease. So when we put the two grants together, we could put the NH&MRC grant to do the ultrasound studies together with the Raine grant to follow these children up into the future and in fact for life. And that was the origin of the Raine study. This is the grant application written in August 1988. And I wrote this in 2 sittings. I was so full of passion at the opportunity of doing this. It had been building up in me for years. And I wrote this in 2 sittings, but I was just a junior obstetrician who'd just come back from my overseas training. I was completely unknown and I needed help. So I went to the 3 big figures in the town who could possibly help. That was Con Michael, who was my boss, who was the professor and head of the university department, Professor Lou Landau, who was the professor and head of the Department of Pediatrics, and Dr. Fiona Stanley, who's an epidemiologist at Sir Charles Gardner Hospital, and who I'd met, and I thought she probably had quite a good future in this field. So I went to them, and they very graciously agreed to help get this study funded and to get it off the ground. And without their help, this wouldn't have happened. So we then started this study. Now, it started as a randomised controlled trial because that's what the NH&MRC grant was. And in fact, the purpose of the trial was to prevent preterm birth, which has been a very long-standing interest of mine. And the idea was that if we did frequent ultrasounds, that's 5 as opposed to 1, and at that time, 5 ultrasounds in one pregnancy was a lot of imaging, that we would reduce the risk of preterm birth. And that was a very hot hypothesis at the time, because it was thought that these ultrasounds would allay anxiety, and it was thought that anxiety and stress was one of the major causes of preterm birth. We now know that's not really the case. But this was the power of the study, was to reduce the rate of preterm birth, hopefully from 7 to 4.5%. It didn't lower the rate of preterm birth, but it enabled us to have a cohort with 2 very similar groups, the treatment group and the control group, that we could study thereafter. And this was the study design, which was ultrasound and Doppler flow studies from 18 to 38 weeks, as opposed to just a single ultrasound, unless others were indicated for clinical reasons. I just want to tell you this story about this woman, Dr. Moira Westmore, because without Moira, the Raine study would never have happened. So the grant was awarded at the beginning of 1989. We had all the money, we had everything in place. We'd done this study on 500 women before. We were now just going to do it on 3,000. We had all the resources, we had all the people in place. But the medical advisory committee of the hospital found out about it and said, no, you can't do this. This isn't going to work. And so they asked me to present myself to the medical advisory committee, at which the chair of the committee, an accountant, the hospital senior accountant, informed me that it had been discussed, the grant had been reviewed internally, and it was considered not possible to do this study, that it wouldn't work, and the hospital had other priorities. I argued that it was terribly important, that it would last for life, that it become a West Australian treasure, but they didn't agree. But the hospital had a new head of anaesthesia who just arrived. She was in her 30s. She'd just come from Melbourne. Her name was Moira Westmore, and it was the first time I'd met her. And she was sitting at the table, and she's an anaesthetist still in Perth. And Moira speaks her mind, and very effectively. And so, just as all was lost, as they told me I was going to have to hand the money back, Moira just said, and these were her exact words, "I'll give him a go." And in an amazing twist, the entire committee just turned on its head, with Moira saying, "Just give him a go." And I've asked her to do that again. In fact, we need to record Moira saying, "Give him a go," because that turned the whole thing, and the Raine study was then given permission to proceed. So if you're a young person and you think you're embarking upon a grand idea and it's very important to you, you're going to meet resistance. In fact, you only know you're moving forwards when you do hit resistance. But don't think that any of these things have happened without a degree of resistance. But this is the woman, an anaesthetist, a brand new anaesthetist in our hospital, who turned the story around with just 4 words. And then we put together the team, and this is the original Raine study team outside King Edward Memorial Hospital. And that was before I started dyeing my hair grey. I'd like to spend half an hour going through all the people in here, and we're going to have a birthday party soon for these people. The very important people to mention are Dr. Sharon Evans, sitting at the front on the left, who was the biostatistician. She'd just arrived from New Zealand. And Sharon played a very important role in the design of the study and making sure it was well computerized and happened. We originally had trouble with recruitment, and we've since learnt that recruiting people into a study like this requires a very, very special sort of person. The woman sitting at the front on the right is Pam Stevenson, and she actually recruited most of the people into the Raine study. So most Raine, Gen 1 people would probably recognise her. At the back on the left was the head of statistics at the University of Western Australia, who was also very instrumental. At that time, the idea that early life events would play out for the rest of your life was considered medical heresy. It thought that life really began at birth, and the idea that things that occurred to a fetus would actually mean something later was not well accepted at all. But simultaneously in England, this man was doing studies, retrospective studies. His name is Professor David Barker. He's Winston Churchill's great nephew. And he had started in 1989 at the same time doing studies in England showing the importance of birth weight and placental weight in programming for future cardiovascular disease. David Barker was a very important person in us working up this field. And the field grew into this. So by 2003, this was the establishment of the International Society, which was to study the early life origins of disease. It was called Foad. This was its original name and original logo. I was on the committee that established this in Southampton. It stood for Fetal Origins of Adult Disease, because all of us at the table were all fetal physiologists or fetal medicine people. That name meant something very bad in texting in the Northern Hemisphere. And the moment young kids found out about it, the name had to be changed. And the name was changed to this, which is DOHAD, Developmental Origins of Health and Disease. It originally rose out of Southampton and India with a lot of involvement from Australia. And we held the World Congress here, the 5th World Congress in 2007 in Perth, in the brand new convention centre. And this was the original poster for it. So the Raine study has played a very important part internationally in helping build the concept that early life events play out for the rest of your life. And of all the things that the Raine study's done, I think underpinning the development of this new international understanding has probably been its greatest contribution. I've run out of time, and I would just like to thank everybody for listening. Most importantly, to thank everybody in the Raine study, the hundreds of people who picked up this story and run with it. I started with an idea, but it's the hundreds of you who've made it work. It's now one of Western Australia's, in fact, one of Australia's greatest treasures, and I hope you can all treasure it as much as I will. In my final words, I'd like to thank Jan Stewart for chairing the board, and I'd like to thank Professor Peter Eastwood for having done such a wonderful job recently as our director. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John. Look, we probably won't have questions because the technical glitch, but I would like to say, I mean, Jan referred to John as the father of the Raine study. I tend to refer to him as the godfather. I'm not quite sure if he likes that or not, but his contribution, you know, cannot be understated. He's made an extraordinary effort. And as I say to many people, the vast majority of cohort studies that start up never make it past 5 years. The fact that Raine now is 30 years on is a huge effort a huge testament to the effort of people like John and many others as well. So John, again, you know, thank you so much for your early input into the Raine, and of course your continued input. We're now moving on to the first of the 2 early career researcher sessions. And I remind you that if you'd like to pose a question, do so using the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. And the chairs, who I'm pleased to introduce, Associate Professor Jenny Downs and Professor Roger Hart, will be able to ask the questions to the presenters on your behalf. So I'll hand over to Roger and Jenny.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. Professor Roger Hart is a Professor of Reproductive Medicine, and I am an Associate Professor in Child Disability. So we span a lot of fields in relation to the topics that you are about to hear. We have 5 presentations of early career researchers that we're about to hear. And they span topics of sleep, stress, growth, and pain, and they are all extremely important topics for our children and as our children grow to become adults in the future. So I would like to introduce the first session, the first presentation. It is Ms. Kelly Sampson, and she will talk about the interaction between sleep apnea and sleep duration on hypertension risk. And this is a part of her PhD studies with Professor Peter Eastwood here in the Raine study. Thank you, Kelly.
Just checking, can everyone hear? This is Kate and this is Kelly here. Just checking that everyone can hear us. If I can get a thumbs up if you can hear us, that would be lovely. Yes, yes, wonderful. And we're just sharing our screen, the wonders of modern technology. Okay, I'm just going to have to run in there and stop screen sharing. Sorry, you are our guinea pig. You get extra points for being our guinea pig.
Jeez. Ellie, you should be fine to share the screen now.
All right. Is that sharing?
That is, yes. Oh, wait, not quite yet. Oh, we can see it, yes. If you just move into presentation mode, I'll just come through.
All right. Is that all on display now?
Perfect.
All right. Thank you very much for the introduction. So I'll just jump straight in. So obstructive sleep apnea is a condition that's characterized by relaxation of the muscles of the upper airway during sleep, and this can cause disruption to breathing. So to diagrammatically represent this, this is an image of a person lying down. Here we have the roof of the mouth, the soft palate, and the tongue. The tongue can become floppy during sleep and can fall back onto the throat, and this can disrupt airflow. So here is an illustration of normal breathing and then a reduction in airflow, and that we call a hypopnea if airflow is partially obstructed. If airflow is completely obstructed, we call this an apnea. So the severity of sleep apnea is determined by the apnea-hypopnea index, which is a measure of how many times these apneas and hypopneas occur per an hour of sleep. And we refer to this as the AHI. So I'll be referring to this quite a lot as I go through the presentation. And it's a measure of severity of sleep apnea. So obstructive sleep apnea is well known to have an association with hypertension. It's unclear the mechanisms behind this, but one of the leading hypotheses is that these drops in oxygen levels caused by these apneas and hypopneas can lead to increased blood pressure and sympathetic activation, which over time can cause hypertension. Recently, sleep duration has been looked at as a modifying effect for the relationship between sleep apnea and hypertension. So it's thought that optimizing sleep duration could reduce your risk for hypertension. So sleep duration, what's recommended for the average adult is 7 to 8 hours, and anything less than this is considered to be poor sleep and has been associated with poorer health outcomes. And on the other side of the spectrum, anything greater than that has also been associated with poorer health outcomes. So the main objective of this study was to determine if sleep duration modifies the association between obstructive sleep apnea and hypertension. So participants for this study were generation 1 participants of the Raine study, and there was 1,098 participants, of which 58% were female and a middle-aged population, and they were followed up between 2014 and 2017. So of particular interest to this study, of the tests that they had done, they had in laboratory sleep studies, which was performed at the Centre of Sleep Science, as pictured here. And this allows us to objectively determine sleep duration, as well as to diagnose obstructive sleep apnea. During the sleep study, they had blood pressure measurements taken before and after sleep, as well as they had a physical exam, which also included multiple blood pressure measurements. And they also completed multiple health questionnaires. So for this study, people were excluded if they did not have blood pressure data collected, did not perform a sleep study, were night shift workers, or reported sleeping pill use. So we defined hypertension based on doctor diagnosis. So this was asked in a health questionnaire if they had been diagnosed with hypertension. And also we took an average of all the blood pressure measures. And if the systolic blood pressure measure on average was greater or equal to 140 millimeters mercury, or diastolic was greater or equal to 90 millimeters mercury, they were considered as hypertensive. So for the analysis, we examined the relationship between sleep duration and obstructive sleep apnea using logistic regression. So there was 1,098 participants. After exclusion criteria, we had a total of 773. So we divided the cohort into 3 groups based on tertiles on sleep duration. So we had the very short sleepers, and normal sleepers. The total sleep time was 5 hours for very short sleepers, 6 hours for the short sleepers on average, and the normal sleepers about 7 hours. There was 52% females in the very short sleepers and about 60% in the other groups. So the age range was, although it was different among the groups, it was overall middle-aged population. And the BMI was significantly higher in the very short sleepers group and the lowest BMI in the normal sleeping group. Hypertension prevalence was also very high in the very short sleepers, as well as obstructive sleep apnea prevalence was also highest in the very short sleepers. And the AHI, or apnea-hypopnea index, was also highest in the very short sleepers, although it was not too different between normal sleepers and short sleepers. So this graph represents the results from the logistic regression, looking at the relationship between sleep apnea and risk for hypertension after stratification by sleep duration. And this is the fully adjusted model, which is adjusted for age, sex, BMI, smoking, alcohol, and activity and depression. So on the y-axis, we have the odds ratio, and on the x-axis, we have sleep duration. So with the sleep apnea severity, we categorize people according to tertiles as the lowest AHI, medium AHI, and high AHI. It's represented by the colors. So we can see in the people with normal sleep, the reference group were people with the lowest AHI and had approximately 7 hours of sleep. And we can see here, the whiskers represents the 95% confidence interval. There was higher odds for hypertension among those with a higher severity of sleep apnea, but this was not significantly different as one is included within the 95% confidence interval. Again, for the short sleepers, a trend for higher odds, but not significantly different. But what we found is in the very short sleepers, those who had a high AHI and slept very short duration compared to this reference group, they had significantly higher odds for hypertension, and this was 3 times more than the reference group. So the limitations of the study is that it was performed in a laboratory, so it might not reflect habitual sleep duration, and there's also a ceiling effect. As you might see in the results, there was no one that had slept more than 8 hours. So what this might do is it might cause long sleepers to be misclassified into the normal sleep duration. So moving forward, as a part of my PhD, we'll also be looking at self-reported sleep duration, which was reported in a questionnaire, as well as actigraphy-based measures, which is determined from a watch. So participants also wore a watch for 7 days, which allows us to objectively determine sleep duration. And that might be more representative of their normal sleep. So in conclusion, we found that the very short sleepers were at the highest risk for hypertension, those with highest sleep apnea severity that slept for a shorter period of time, and also that the very short sleepers had higher comorbidities, higher BMI, as well as high hypertension and obstructive sleep apnea prevalence. So potentially, optimizing sleep duration might reduce the risk for hypertension. And as I said previously, we will include other measures of sleep duration to strengthen these findings. Lastly, I would just like to acknowledge my supervisors and the advice I received during this project. And most importantly, I'd like to acknowledge the Raine Study participants and their family for their ongoing support in this study and all the funding and contribution. And I'd like to acknowledge Professor Peter Eastwood, who supported this particular follow-up study with an NHMRC grant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. That's a fantastic presentation, and that was marvelous. Just one question that I have. I think we are short of time. You were brilliant timekeeping. It was the previous issues with the communication. I think that's limit things. But what I always wonder about sleep studies is how representative the sleep studies of actually the proper sleep environment. And we saw a fantastic photo there you sent in your slides of linked up to all these monitors. How representative are sleep studies of real sleep?
Yes, and that's obviously one of the biggest limitations to this, and we haven't yet received actigraphy data, so it'd be interesting to see how the study sleep duration determined in the polysomnogram sleep study, how that compares to how we measure sleep at home, and if it does represent normal sleep. So we would suspect that it doesn't, in terms of the fact that we have a ceiling effect when they're sleeping in a laboratory. So it would be interesting once we get those results to see how predictive sleeping in a laboratory is when compared to sleeping at home.
Okay, well thanks very much, Kelly. That's a fantastic presentation. In the interest of time, we have to move on because we are running behind. So I'd like to introduce the next speaker. That's Dr. Monique Robinson. Monique completed a PhD at the University of Western Australia. She's currently an NHMRC Early Career Fellow at the Telethon Kids Institute, and her primary research focus is the relationship between parents and children, in particular how maternal stress and other life factors impact child and mental health. So I'd like to welcome Monique, who's going to talk about maternal prenatal stress exposure and sex-specific risk of severe infection in offspring. Thank you, Monique.
Need to get my slides. Will they automatically pop up? Yeah. Thanks very much. And here I am, 15 years into my career with the Raine Study and still an early career researcher due to the 20 children I've had in between. So I'm going to talk today about prenatal stress exposure and the sex-specific risk of severe infection in offspring. We know that stress has a very well-known link to non-communicable diseases like heart disease, cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, and prenatal stress also has been established to have a relationship with those sort of issues. But what is less well known is the link with infectious diseases and immunity in early life. So back in 2012, this has been a fair gestation for this study, but Dave Bergner, who's a paediatrician now in Melbourne, sent me an article about the Danish National Birth Cohort, a really big Danish population study. And in this study, they found that experiencing death of a relative or divorce during pregnancy led to a higher risk for infectious diseases in offspring. Since then, this has been found again in some other studies, but we found that no one really was looking at the sex-specific differences, and we do know that males tend to be more vulnerable to the effects of prenatal stress. So the Raine study formed a really, really good cohort to be able to look at this. In the Raine study, I've done a lot of work on the prenatal stress in the Raine study. We have these stressful life events, about 10 events measured at 18 and then 34 weeks. For this particular study, in order to kind of condense the categories, we combined the death of a relative and death of a friend together as one variable. We combined separation and divorce and relationship problems together as one, and job loss, partners, job loss, and money problems we put together. So we ended up with 6 different stressful life events that we can measure then over time, how it affected the child's immunity and vulnerability to infectious diseases. Back in 2012, this was linked through an enormous paperwork process to through the data linkage unit at the health department to hospital morbidity data. And what we were able to get then were ICD codes for infectious disease hospital admissions up to 16 years old. And we found quite high numbers of infections. For any infection of being admitted to hospital and having an infection, this is primary and secondary diagnosis codes. We found about over 40% of our cohort that we had with full data set there. Lower respiratory tract infections, like pneumonia, bronchitis, were also common, the most common being upper respiratory tract infections. So what we know is, I guess, cold, influenza, etc. And then sort of lower for some of these other things. Now, there's a whole lot of ICD codes that sit behind these categories, a massive, massive file that we've got as a supplementary file. So I won't go into all of that, but these are the main categories that we had. In total, we had 2,141 Raine Gen 1 and Gen 2 sort of pairs. In Gen 1, we were looking at maternal age, maternal education, maternal smoking, and whether or not there were siblings in the family as our covariates. And then, as I said, we separated by sex because we found in previous work in Raine and also in the literature that males have a particular vulnerability, and we weren't quite sure how that was going to affect this particular study. We looked at increasing stress and the likelihood of hospitalisation between 0 and 16 years. We also looked at the timing of the stress, whether earlier in pregnancy, in the first half of pregnancy, or the second half of pregnancy would be more important. We looked at the specific types of stress, as I showed those different variables, whether perhaps the stress that is caused by particular events in life are more important than other things. And hang on a sec, I can't see that one. There we go. And we also wanted to look at whether stress during the first 5 years, whether hospitalizations during the first 5 years was more important than looking all over time. So whether there was a specific period of vulnerability early in the child's life. Okay, the results. I'm going to go through this really quickly. I think what's most striking is that we pretty much found nothing in females. The results that we found were all in the males. And when we combine them together, it kind of just took away some of the strength of that. So it was really important to look at sex-specific results in this particular case. These are the significant ORs for increasing stress events and the likelihood of infectious disease admission. And we can see quite strong, except for genitourinary, that's often urinary tract infections and more common in females anyway. But we found a really strong effect that increasing stress led to an increased risk of hospitalisation for infectious diseases. In terms of timing, that really didn't show that it was that important, maybe a little bit stronger in terms of the odds ratios for later in pregnancy. But perhaps as well, if we're looking at stress before 18 weeks, it may be very, very early in pregnancy in a lot of other research that we see those effects of timing. So perhaps this sort of all got a little bit mixed up with our timing there. In terms of the types of stress, this was quite interesting. Again, it didn't really seem like any specific events were causing the effects, driving it specifically. Pregnancy problems were linked to a higher risk for those first 3 infectious diseases. Now, that could be that the pregnancy is stressful because there's a health problem with the baby, which then makes it vulnerable to infectious disease risk. But what was really striking here is that problems with other children showed such a strong relationship with infectious disease admissions. We often focus on first-time mums, I think, in terms of stress, and we sort of see that that's our audience of the most vulnerable in terms of prenatal stress and worry. But perhaps this is indicating that it's the mums who are going through the system sort of subsequent times that might be particularly needed to focus on some stress reduction and interventions. And in the first 5 years, there was nothing really much to report here different to looking at the first 16 years. So it wasn't that that particular first 5 years was a heightened period of vulnerability. So in summary, the increased exposure to stressful life events was associated with sex-specific infection-related hospitalisations in childhood and for boys. And we can see there's a lot of potential mechanisms here with stress affecting the early immune development. From here, the story is still developing. Obviously, it's been quite a long time getting this paper sort of through to this point, but we're interested in working now with the ear health group at Telethon Kids Institute to look at early stress and potential otitis media infections early in life, and to really understand a little bit better with the mechanisms on what might be causing these results. I'd like to acknowledge obviously all our Raine Study funders, donors, and everyone who has participated in the Raine Study over such a long time. For me, again, it's holds such a special place in my heart with my career, being based on the Raine Study for so long and having such a long, happy relationship with Raine. And my co-authors. Now, when a paper takes 8 years and the sort of lead author keeps disappearing and going AWOL, these people, especially, I'd like to thank Dave Bergner for being so patient, and hopefully from here things will move a little bit quicker. So thank you very much.
Hello Monique, thank you so much, and thank you also for your persistence in the field of stress during pregnancy. It's really terrific, and it's starting to pay real dividends. We have one question so far, and the question is asking you, what other factors along with stress in pregnancy did you consider in your analyses?
So we looked at the maternal age in this particular study, and maternal education, smoking in pregnancy, and the presence of the other siblings. The difficulty with some of these, there's a lot of these factors that are actually linked to the stress. So it was difficult not to complicate things there with our covariates. If we put too many covariates in, we may have been kind of overdoing it a bit. Unfortunately, I think every time I sort of have a draft, or when I've just recently submitted it, as per usual, we get asked to put a whole lot more things in. So we've ended up with our sort of, I guess, a good reasoning for the variables that we've included and that we've kept in there. But actually, as it turns out, those particular covariates didn't really change our results much from the univariate analysis anyway.
Thank you, Monique. And there has been a comment that the association with other siblings is really interesting. And that was one of my questions. But you mentioned there were problems with other siblings. Did you mean the presence of other siblings?
No, it's stress related to having other children.
All right. Okay.
Yeah. So
okay.
stress caused by other children.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And thank you. Thank you very much, Monique. Thank you for your presentation. And we have to call that time now. Thank you very much. So I would now like to introduce Dr. Ashish Yadav, who will talk about the relationship between fetal growth during pregnancy and blood pressure in adult. Another example of very longitudinal data collections telling us about how later life is. And thank you very much, Ashish.
Thank you for the introduction, Jenny. I hope I'm audible enough. Just wanted to confirm if I can share the screen.
Need to share your screen?
Yeah, it's still not allowing me to share. Yeah, I can now. Is it visible now? Okay, perfect. So thank you for the introduction. My name is Ashish, and I'll be talking about my study, which was conceptualized around the Barker hypothesis. And we just heard from John about this British epidemiologist, David Barker, who proposed that premature birth or low birth weight can predispose to diseases like hypertension and other cardiac diseases in adulthood. This hypothesis later evolved into the developmental origins of health and disease, the Dohart concept, where it postulates that any exposure to the environmental influences during critical periods of growth can have significant consequences on the individual's health in later life. So, so the next question was, how do we assess fetal growth? Of course, there is birth weight, which we all know that it's a simple measure. It's almost always recorded and can be easily compared across different studies. However, the downside is that it is just a one-time cross-sectional measure, and hence it does not accurately reflect what happens during pregnancy. And of course, it is available only after birth. So a more reliable way of assessing fetal growth is to look at serial ultrasound measures, looking at biomarkers like abdominal circumference of the fetus, femur length, and head circumference at different time points across gestation. So with that in mind, we decided to examine the association between fetal growth trajectories determined by serial ultrasounds in pregnancy and blood pressure of the offspring in adulthood. For the purpose of today's presentation, I'll focus only on the head circumference and the abdominal circumference growth trajectories, and we will look at their association with the systolic blood pressure in Gen 2 adults. Coming to the study design and methods, we took the ultrasound data from the Gen 1 pregnant females of the Raine study. This, of course, goes back to the original trial conducted by John in 1993, wherein 2868 mother-fetal pairs were randomized either into an intervention arm or the regular arm. While the intervention arm participants were intended to undergo 5 scans, the regular arm participants just had to go a single scan at 18 weeks. For the purpose of our study, to eliminate selection bias, we took the ultrasound data from the intervention arm participants only, and we constructed growth trajectories using a method called group-based trajectory modeling. Let's look at the growth trajectories which we found using abdominal circumference. We found 7 different clusters or groups, as you can see on the graph. On the x-axis here is the period of gestation in weeks. On the y-axis, we have the abdominal circumference, STS, the standard deviation score, commonly referred to as the Z-score, wherein 0 represents the average or the near normal growth. Anything on the plus side is higher than normal, and anything on the negative side is lower than normal growth. So if we look at around 18 weeks of gestation, we found 2 groups that showed higher than normal growth. There were 3 groups which showed near normal or average growth, and there were 2 groups which showed less than normal growth. For the sake of our analysis, we took group 3 as the reference group. Now, before we discuss the results, I just wanted to highlight the patterns that emerged in these trajectories. Now, if you look at group 3 and group 6, they started very differently at around 18 weeks, but near birth, they almost had the same growth. Similarly, groups 2 and group 4 started very differently, but then they converged during gestation at around 38 weeks. They almost had the same growth. So using head circumference, we found 5 different groups or trajectories. Again, at around 18 weeks, there was 1 group which showed higher than normal growth. There were 2 groups which showed average or near normal growth, and then there were 2 groups which showed less than normal growth. For this analysis, we took group 4 as the reference group. Now, once we had the trajectories, we analyzed them for the association with adult blood pressure using a linear mixed modeling method. In this, the outcome was systolic blood pressure at 20, 22, and 27 years. The blood pressure was recorded in seated position using Dynamap, which was said to take 6 readings every 2 minutes, and the average was taken after excluding the first reading. We adjusted for sex, age, BMI, and ethnicity of the Gen 2 adults, along with some lifestyle factors. Now let's look at the results for the association between the abdominal circumference growth trajectory and adult systolic blood pressure. There was 1 group which was significantly different from the reference group, and we can see that it was group 1, wherein the participants had their systolic blood pressure higher by 3.5 millimeters of mercury as compared to the reference group, which was group 3. The mean systolic blood pressure for group 1 participants was around 120 millimeters, and that of group 3 participants was around 117 millimeters of mercury. We also looked at the difference in the systolic blood pressure between the 2 extreme groups, which are group 7 and group 1, and that was around 5 millimeters of mercury. Looking at the association between the head circumference growth trajectory and the systolic blood pressure, we found 2 groups which were significantly different from the reference group, or the group 4 in this case. So there was group 1 where the systolic blood pressure was higher by 3.5 millimeters of mercury compared to the reference group. And on this graph, you can see that there was group 2 where the participants' systolic blood pressure was higher by 1.5 millimeters of mercury as compared to the reference group 4. Again, we looked at the difference in the systolic blood pressure between the 2 extreme groups, and that was around 4 millimeters of mercury. Now, to summarize, in our study, we found different patterns of fetal growth, which of course could not have been captured if we were to rely on birth weight alone. More importantly, we found that restricted fetal growth during pregnancy is associated with significantly higher blood pressure in the offspring during young adulthood. So to conclude, there are fetal growth patterns which are set quite early in pregnancy, which suggests a possible role of pre-pregnancy environment in influencing not just the fetal growth, but also the future outcomes. And hence there is an opportunity for public health interventions to target some of the maternal factors that predispose to poor fetal growth in order to impede the development of diseases like hypertension. It's a long list, but I would like to acknowledge everyone listed here, especially the Raine Study participants and their families for their long-standing contribution, and all my co-investigators for their support. That was all. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll take the questions.
Thank you very much, Yadav. That's a fantastic presentation, and just stopping your screen share. Did you control for perhaps a genetic risk? Because presumably those families that have a genetic predisposition towards hypertension are more likely to get hypertension, and they could have had adverse patterns. So if you control for that, would you get a greater disparity according to fetal growth patterns? How do you address that?
Say that again.
Well, it could be a genetic predisposition. So the the hypertension in pregnancy is a marker of that.
Yeah, the model which I showed looked at all the adult covariates. We built another model which additionally looked for all the maternal and the pregnancy characteristics, where we included everything else. And fortunately, the association still held. And we did find higher systolic blood pressure for those restricted growth trajectories.
Okay, well, thanks very much for doing this. The time, that's 10 minutes is up. Thanks, Yadav. I'd like to introduce the next speaker. So this next speaker is by Miss Anne-Marie Bennett. And Anne-Marie has recently graduated from the University of Western Australia, and the research she's presenting formed part of her Masters of Public Health that she was awarded. She completed a Bachelor of Health Science at Edith Cowan in 2013, majoring in nutrition, and worked at St Charles Garden Hospital as a bone density technologist before she moved into a current position with the Food Bank as a public health nutritionist. So I'd like to welcome Anne-Marie, and she's going to talk to us today on the prospective associations of sugar-sweetened beverage consumption during adolescence with body composition and bone mass in early adulthood. So welcome, Anne-Marie. Thank you.
Hi, can you all see and hear me?
We can now.
Wonderful, perfect. So thank you for inviting me to talk here today at the scientific meeting. My name is Raine Bennett, and I completed this research as part of my master's degree at UWA last year. The aim of the research was to study associations of sugar-sweetened beverage intake, which I'll refer to as SSB, at 14, 17 and 20 years of age with body composition and bone health at 20 years of age in young adults in Western Australia. And our hypotheses were that SSB would have a positive association with fat mass and a negative association with bone mineral content. We all know the statistics on overweight and obesity in adults, but I didn't know that almost a third of adolescents and 39% of young adults are overweight and obese in Australia, which is concerning, as adults with excess weight are more likely to be overweight and obese as adults, and they are more likely to experience illness and have a shorter life expectancy than adults that are in the healthy weight range. For osteoporosis, it's a disease that develops over the life course, and it results in thin and fragile bones. 10% of Australians over 50 have osteoporosis, and it's more common in women. In adolescence, bone deposition is at its highest, and peak bone mass is obtained during the 20s. And what's important is 20 to 40% of the variance on peak bone mass is determined by modifiable risk factors like diet. And it's been estimated that increasing the peak bone mass by 10% will delay the onset of osteoporosis by 13 years. So it's really important to ensure adolescents reach an optimal peak bone mass, and should be a key prevention strategy. Looking at the research, there's a lot of research on sugary drink consumption and body composition. Most studies report positive associations, but not all. Notably, the 2007 Australian National Children's and Physical Activity Survey. Most studies use BMI with either self-reported measurements or data collected from trained staff. There's been not as much research on bone health and sugary drink consumption. The majority of studies show a negative association with SSB consumption and bone health, and some only see these associations in women. Bone mineral content is a better measure of bone health and is what we used as our outcome measure, as bone mineral density is significantly influenced by bone size. And the gap that we found in the literature there had been no studies looking at sugary drink consumption in adolescent populations when they're reaching their peak bone mass and using a DEXA machine to get the outcome variables. So for the methods, 1,493 participants participated in the Gen 2 20 follow-up. For this study, 356 were excluded. Some did not participate in the DEXA scan. There were some invalid scans, or they needed to have at least one sugary drink intake measurement at either the Gen 2 14, Gen 2 17, or Gen 2 20 follow-up. At each of the follow-ups, the complete cases was only 70 to 88% of all participants that had at least one DEXA scan and one sugary drink intake measurement. Now, because 12 to 30% of the participants had missing data, it was decided to do multiple imputation on the data set, and we included the predicted variable sugary drink intake after the data was imputed. We analysed the data using linear regression, and we used the multiple imputation data and complete cases, which was all participants with no missing data in Model 3. Because sugary drink consumption was skewed with many reporting a zero intake, we categorised them into 3 tertiles. So we had less than half a serve to 1.3 serves, and 1.3 serves per day, where 1 serve is 260 grams. For the models, they were pretty similar, apart from dietary factors. We looked at maternal education, screen time, physical activity, and misreporting. And we included a healthy and Western dietary pattern Z score in Model 3, and sugary drink consumption has been shown to be part of an unhealthy diet overall. So this is just a table of the baseline demographics from the Gen 2 14 follow-up, so at 14 years, grouped into their serves. And the majority of the characteristics were not significantly different across the 3 serve groups. Most notably BMI, and that was the same for the Gen 2 17 and Gen 2 20 follow-up as well. So the results, SSB consumption and total body fat mass. At 14 years, girls who consumed more than 1.3 serves of SSPB per day had significantly more fat mass than girls who consumed less. And the estimated difference in means is 2.4 kilos, which is equal to about 14% more fat mass than girls who consumed less than half a serve per day. And we did not see any association in boys. At the 17 years, those who consumed more than 1.3 serves of SSB per day had again significantly more fat mass than boys who consumed less. And at both 17 and 14 years follow-up, once we included the dietary patterns into the models, these associations were no longer significant. At 20 years, males who consumed more than 1.3 serves of SSB per day had significantly more fat mass than those who consumed less. And most importantly, these associations remained significant in Model 3 after the inclusion of dietary patterns. So men who consumed more than 1.3 serves of SSP per day had on average 3 kilos or 17% more fat mass than those who consumed less than half a serve a day. For SSB consumption and total body lean mass, we didn't really find any significant associations. And contrary to our hypotheses, we did not find any association between sugary drink consumption and bone mineral content. One of the strengths of the study was that we used a DEXA machine to measure fat mass. BMI has been shown to have a low sensitivity when identifying excess fat mass, and this association, none of these associations would have been found if we'd used BMI as our outcome measure. The Raine data cohort is a wealth of data, and just the large number of participants is a major strength, as most of the studies we looked at had less than 400 participants in the study. Again, most studies control for covariates such as physical activity and screen time and dietary factors, but there's minimal studies that include dietary patterns in the analyses, and that was a major strength of the study. A limitation was the missing data in the study, but we tried to mitigate that with the use of multiple imputation, and the results of the complete cases and the multiple imputation cases were very similar, and most associations were seen in both. And in conclusion, the study provides evidence that high consumption of SSB in adolescents and early adulthood is associated with increased fat mass in young adults, and in particular males. And though contrary to our hypothesis, no associations were seen with BMC. I'd just like to acknowledge the Raine study, and special mentions to my supervisor, Kevin Murray, and Dr. Kathy Zhu. Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you, Anne-Marie. I'm wondering if while we take questions, you're able to stop sharing your screen to be getting ready. And I do see one question. Did you notice any differences in your results before and after the multiple imputation?
No, so we analysed we analysed the complete cases as well, and we did the whole analyses, and the results were very similar. And at the 20 years in males, those findings all were the same. Yeah, so we didn't see very many differences at all.
Thank you. And another question is, did you look at results, or are you thinking about looking at results using waist circumference as your predictor variable rather than BMI?
Yeah, well, we didn't use BMI because we didn't use BMI as an outcome variable because we had the body composition data from the DEXA scan, but the waist circumference could have been a variable that we could look at as well. It's just in the literature, the majority of studies are using BMI as their outcome variable, and so we wanted to be able to translate that and sort of be able to talk in the same way, and show that using a DEXA machine to measure body composition is a better method of talking about excess weight.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'd now like to ask the final speaker to be loading your slides in, opening your screen. And if I would like to introduce Ms. Lindsay O'Kane, who will present on relationships between pelvic pain and pain sensitivity in young women. And she's originally from Auckland, is now in Melbourne, and an example of reach of the Raine study to researchers beyond Perth. So this is fabulous. Thank you very much, Lindsay.
Hello, welcome everybody on behalf of my project group, and a special thanks to the Raine Study for hosting this event today. So pelvic pain is a potentially debilitating condition which impacts approximately 1 in 4 women worldwide. Having pelvic pain has been found to reduce quality of life, increase psychological distress, and the financial burden is immense. Pelvic pain can be defined as pain in the lower abdominal, below the level of the umbilicus, including the pelvic organs and genitalia. The understanding of pelvic pain is multifactorial and not yet fully clear. Current evidence suggests an association.
Excuse me, Lindsay. So sorry to interrupt. We can't actually see you. Could you turn your video on?
Oh, turn my video on.
Your slides, but we can't see you speaking.
Oh.
Your video on Zoom.
Yes, your video on Zoom.
There you go. Hi, is that all right? Do you want me to start at the beginning?
There we are. Lovely. And then if you just go back to your... No, it's all right. We heard everything and we saw your slides. We just couldn't see you.
Ah,
fantastic. Sorry. Thank you so much.
All right. I'll start back where I was. All right. The understanding of pelvic pain is multifactorial and not yet fully clear. Current evidence suggests an association between pelvic pain and pain sensitivity. However, there are significant gaps in the literature regarding pelvic pain in young women, as well as a lack of large studies with robust control for confounding factors. We hypothesize that more bothersome levels of pelvic pain is associated with an increase in pain sensitivity in young women after controlling for potential confounders. This cross-sectional study looked at data from the Raine study and the Generation 2 22-year follow-up. The Raine study is an integral intergenerational population cohort study. Included in the study were females that completed the urogenital distress inventory who also had at least one valid sensitivity measure, resulting in 475 women, and ethics approval was obtained. For the assessment of pelvic pain, the question we used was, do you experience, and if so, how much are you bothered by pain or discomfort in the lower abdomen/genital area? The answers were classified into 1, no pelvic pain, 2, mild pelvic pain, and 3, moderate to severe pelvic pain. Pain sensitivity was measured with quantitative sensory testing using standardized protocol. In order to capture widespread sensitivity data, pressure pain thresholds and cold pain thresholds were obtained by measurements of several test sites on the body. Both of these measures have been shown to be reliable. There were many potential confounders and women's health variables from the 22-year time point, and here are some of these examples. We received the data from the Raine study and we cleaned it and found out who fitted the inclusion criteria. Then we did descriptives of all the pelvic pain groups, women's health variables, and confounding factors. After that, we did a univariable analysis to investigate the relationship of each potential confounding variable with pressure pain thresholds and cold pain thresholds. And then we did a multivariable regression analysis and we checked for interactions. Here is our main findings. For the pressure pain threshold, we have on the y-axis and the pelvic pain groups on the x-axis. The moderate to severe pelvic pain group was significantly more sensitive to pressure than the no pain group. For the cold pain threshold, we have the degrees Celsius on the y-axis and we have the pelvic pain groups on the x-axis. The moderate to severe pelvic pain group was also more sensitive than the no pain group. Additionally, the study found that the moderate to severe pelvic pain groups compared to the no pelvic pain group consistently reported more urogenital problems. This includes pain with intercourse, increased menstrual problems, bladder symptoms, all having a significant p-value. So, this was the first study that has looked at pelvic pain not related to menstrual pain in a relatively large group of young women. The result supports our hypothesis as well as the evidence in the literature suggesting that women with pelvic pain have a higher degree of pain sensitivity compared to women without pelvic pain. A similar study based on the same cohort by Slater and colleagues, which included women with menstrual-related pelvic pain, found widespread cold sensitivity in women with the most bothersome pelvic pain. However, in contrast to Slater, this study also found widespread pressure sensitivity as a feature of the most severe pelvic pain groups. With this study, in addition to previous studies, there's consistent evidence to suggest that pelvic pain mechanisms include augmented central nociceptive processing. The strength of the study is that it is a community dwelling cohort, utilizes robust measures for pain sensitivity, and accounted for possible confounding factors. Potential limitations of it is that the pelvic pain was defined by only one question. However, this question was further compared to other urogenital and women's health variables to provide a broader representation of pelvic pain state in these women. This study highlights the need to consider pain sensitivity and related comorbidities in the care of young women with pelvic pain. Furthermore, that pain sensitivity should be included as part of a multidimensional process for the assessment of pelvic pain. Future studies resulting of longitudinal studies and clinical trials are required to further explore whether increased pain sensitivity affects the evolution of non-menstrual related pelvic pain. Lastly, more research is required on pain sensitivity's impact on the effectiveness of different treatments for pelvic pain. In conclusion, this study found a positive association between more bothersome pelvic pain and pain sensitivity after controlling for potential confounders. It suggests augmented central nociceptive processing contributes to a heightened pain sensitivity in young women with more severe pelvic pain. We would like to acknowledge everyone involved in our study and our supervisors, the families and participants involved in the study, and the Raine study. Thank you for listening today.
Thank you very much. That's a fantastic presentation. Did you control for hormonal contraception, stage of menstrual cycle, operative intervention? Because obviously pelvic pain is, despite saying non-menstrual, it has a significant relation to gynecology.
Yeah, so we had a look at the oral contraceptive pill, as well as, so we had a look at parity. We had a look at quite a lot of other urogenital women's health variables. Yeah. Were there any other specifics you were interested in? Because we did assess for a few.
Well, pelvic pain is, I mean, it is a lot. It is a substantial menstrual related component to it. The stage of the menstrual cycle, mid-cycle pain, luteal pain is more pelvic congestion, even though it's not regular period. Surgical intervention for laparoscopy, for treatment of adhesions, treatment of endometriosis, all these sort of variables.
So we did look at pain with menstruation as part of that as well. And so whether they experienced it or whether they were on the pill in that. We didn't have a look at whether they had had surgery or questions for that, though. No.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much for your presentation. In the interest of time, we have to move on. So thank you very much for that. So now we're moving to a morning tea break, and obviously, in the interest of time, it's slightly curtailed. We're aiming to be back at 10:45 for our further presentation. So I'd like to, on behalf of my co-chair, I'd like to thank all the presenters for the early career research presentations this morning. They've been fascinating, and thanks so much for your contribution. And personally, on behalf of my co-chair, thank all the Raine staff for all their hard work they do in the background and supporting the Raine study. And thank you for doing this day. So enjoy a quick cup of coffee and back at 10:45. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Welcome back, everyone. My name is Peter Eastwood. I'm the director of the Raine Study, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce the chairs for the next session. This is session 2 of our early career researcher presentations. The first chair will be Darren Beals, Dr. Darren Beals, from Curtin University, and his co-chair will be Koya Aranrinde from the University of Western Australia. So I'll hand over to both of them to run you all through this second session.
Thanks, Peter, and welcome everyone to the second early career research presentation session. We have some interesting presentations spanning epigenetics, lots of interesting use of the longitudinal Raine data, and also some machine learning, so quite an interesting session. So straight to our first presenter, Yiping Chan. So Yiping is a cognition and emotion researcher exploring memory updating and cognitive biases in depressive rumination, and in the role of epigenetics in childhood bullying and suicide risk.
The association between childhood bullying and suicide ideation. So suicide is a public health issue and a leading cause of death in those aged 15 to 29. Suicide risk and behavior includes having suicidal thoughts, self-harm, making plans, and making an attempt to end one's life. Research shows that the risk factors for suicide includes early life adversity and mental illness. And the most commonly studied early life adversity in relation to suicide are maternal mental illness, low socioeconomic status, and childhood bullying. Of these risk factors, bullying is arguably one of the most modifiable risk factors. So research shows a direct pathway from bullying to suicide, as well as through the development of mental illnesses such as depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. So traditional suicide risk assessment relies on subjective self-report questionnaires that directly ask participants about suicide risk constructs directly. So these are flawed in that they rely on retrospective memory of past experiences. Moreover, suicide attempters often deny or conceal their intentions. So there's a need to improve suicide prediction, as a recent study shows that suicide prediction has not improved significantly beyond chance after 50 years, mainly due to the homogeneity of existing research. So one such emerging approach is investigating the biological mechanisms underlying suicide risk. Twin studies shows that suicide risk is heritable, with up to 43% heritability for suicide ideation. So the research shows that the long-term effects of bullying on suicide risk occurs through epigenetics mechanism. So epigenetics is the study of mechanisms that control gene functions, which are affected by genetic, environmental, and developmental factors. The most commonly studied epigenetic mechanism is DNA methylation, which is a biological process whereby carbon and hydrogen atoms are added to the DNA molecule. So DNA methylation is a dynamic process during development and throughout life. So the significance of epigenetics research on suicide risk is highlighted in studies which found that the effects of DNA methylation and structural changes in the brains of children exposed to early life adversity can be reversed. So research has shown that suicide differentiated the brain cells of suicide completers and death from causes other than suicide. So gene expression modification, so DNA methylation in specific genes, including CDKN2A, which has been implicated in suicide, and an accelerated epigenetic aging in the brain cells of suicide completers. So epigenetic aging is when the biological age exceeds your chronological age, and biological age is a better indicator of physiological age and functional capability. So research on the epigenetics of suicide provide an alternative assessment which may improve suicide prediction. So to date, most of the studies on the epigenetics of suicide risk rely largely on cross-sectional studies. So the longitudinal data from the Raine study may provide convergent evidence of previous findings. So the aim of the present study is to investigate the role of epigenetics in the association between bullying and suicide ideation. We hypothesize that bullying will be associated with suicide ideation, that DNA methylation in certain genes will be associated with suicide ideation in victims of childhood bullying, and also that some other epigenetics measures will differentiate suicide ideators from non-ideators. So the measures we used were depression and bullying at various follow-up, and suicide ideation at a 22-year follow-up, and epigenetics measures collected at a 17-year follow-up. And these include epigenome-wide DNA methylation profiling, pyrosequence DNA methylation in CDKN2A, Hausman estimates of some blood cell composition variables, and 4 models of epigenetic aging. And this is what we found. So we correlated bullying, depression across various follow-up and with suicide ideation at the 22-year follow-up. The x-axis shows the time from the 10-year to the 20-year follow-up, and the y-axis shows the correlation. So all correlations are statistically significant, except those which are not visible from the graph. So for example, at the 10-year follow-up on the yellow line, which shows the correlation between depression and suicide ideation, at the 10-year follow-up, that is not statistically significant. So the orange line shows the correlation between bullying and self-report depression, and the blue line shows the correlation between bullying and suicide ideation. This is the forest plot of the odds ratio of suicide risks in 1% change in DNA methylation based on an epigenome-wide logistic regression with predictors, age, biological sex, and bullying predicting suicide ideation. So 2 CpG sites survive the strict Bonferroni correction, and the nearest gene to these 2 CpG sites are CCDC85C and SNX19. So these 2 genes have been implicated in suicide risk. So in addition, the correlations between chronological age, DNA methylation age, and all 4 models of the epigenetic age are statistically significant. However, we failed to replicate an accelerated epigenetic aging in suicide completers. This may be due to the different methodological adopted in the different studies. So the authors actually assessed DNA methylation in brain cells of blood suicide completers, whereas in the present study, we used we assessed DNA methylation in peripheral blood of suicide ideators. What we found instead was that other epigenetic measures differentiated suicide ideators from non-ideators, and this included some blood cell composition variables and also DNA methylation in CDKN2A. However, none of these measures differentiated victims from non-victims of childhood bullying. So taken together, the findings provide evidence of an biological mechanism that contributes to suicide ideation. We interpreted the results in light of some of the limitations. So the sample was relatively small, mainly due to non-random attrition, whereby victims of bullying were disproportionately underrepresented in the suicide ideation response at the 22-year follow-up. There were also some methodological issues which may have contributed to non-replication of previous studies, mainly the timing. There was a time gap in the timing of epigenetics data and suicide ideation collection at 17-year and 22-year follow-up, and also variability in suicide phenotypes and method of assessing DNA methylation across studies. Nevertheless, the findings contribute to an emerging knowledge of the biological process of suicide, of the epigenetics and biological mechanisms underlying suicide. So future studies could assess measures at the same follow-up, especially when DNA methylation is variable and reversible. Conducting a Mendelian randomization will allow us to ascertain the direction of the effect of epigenetics on suicide risk, and also a genome-wide association study may identify specific genes implicated in suicide risk. So we'd like to acknowledge the following participants of the Raine Study and their families, and Young Lives Matter Foundation for funding the research. Thank you.
Thank you, Pin. That was very nice work and well presented. Can I start off with a first question? In regards to bullying, we know the adverse mental health effects are not inevitable. Are there any particular protective effects that you can identify that might be useful?
So basically family support and social support network. So in some countries, and in fact in Australia as well, there are some anti-bullying programs that are implemented in schools, and some of these programs has been found to be quite effective at reducing bullying in school settings. And most of the programs that are effective would involve a multifactorial program whereby they involve family, involve the whole schools. So that would actually highlight the discourage bullying among school children.
Okay, very good. So thank you very much.
So I think you introduced the next one.
So,
well done. Well done.
okay, so next we're going to be having a presentation by Dr. Fujian Wang, who is a medical doctor doing a PhD with Professor Wendy Oddy at the University of Tasmania. It's presented on prospective association between dietary fats and fatty liver index trajectories in a longitudinal cohort population, an 8-year follow-up study from adolescents to young adulthood. Over to Fujian.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Can everybody see the screen? Yeah. Just check the screen. Can everybody see the slides? I share the slides. Hello? Hello? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. Can everybody see the slides? Hello?
Yes, we can see the slide.
Oh, yeah. Oh, good. So everybody, yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Fujian Wang. I'm undertaking this research as part of my PhD at the Moses Institution for Medical Research at the University of Tasmania under the supervision of the Professor Wendy Oddy and Dr. Feng Pan. Here I'm going to introduce the study on association between the dietary fatty acids and the fatty liver risk trajectories from the child to young adults. So first, I will briefly introduce the disease background. So what's the LAFR, the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or the metabolic associated fatty liver disease? The name implies the main characteristic of this disease is too much fat stored in the liver cells and with low or little alcohol consumption. And to better describe the definition of the fatty liver disease, the LAFR is now renamed as the MAFR, which removes the low threshold definition of the alcohol consumption. So why this disease is important? The fatty liver disease is increasingly common around the world, and especially the Western nations. It is the most common form of the chronic liver disease in Australia and the world. And these fatty liver changes in the liver can cause the inflammation, which may progress to the scarring and irreversible damage. At its most worst, it can cause the progress to the cirrhosis and liver cancer. This fatty liver disease occurs in every age group, but especially in the people in the 40 and 50s, who are at the high risk of the obesity and type 2 diabetes. And there's a rising trend in the prevalence of the fatty liver disease in young people to elder people. So what's the dietary factors? The dietary factors are thought to be associated with this disease. The saturated fatty acids are generally thought to be harmful to the liver metabolism. However, there is lack of a longitudinal study on the occurrence and developments of the fatty liver disease in young population. And we use the fatty liver index as a longitudinal outcome to better describe the progression of this disease in the Raine Study population. The FII has been validated by other cohorts and is recommended as an epidemiological research tool by the guideline. Our participants were from the generation 2 from the Raine Study. The exposure factors were collected from the 40-year-olds follow-ups, use the Foad frequency questionnaire data. outcome factors were correlated from the 40 years to 22 years, use the clinical assessment and blood sample data. First, we use the group-based trajectory modeling to create a fatty liver index trajectory model to describe the development of this fatty liver disease from age of the 14 to the 22 years. And then we use the regression model to examine the association between the baseline diet fatty acid exposures and these trajectories. So here's the results. A total of the 985 participants, 3 different FRI trajectories were identified and labeled as the stable low-risk group people, stable high-risk group people, and low to high-risk group people. The rising trend of this trajectory indicated an increasing risk of the fatty liver disease for the individual in that group. And we can see in the stable high-risk group, it has the highest proportion of the males, Caucasian maternal race, and annual family income less than $35,000 per year. And in lifestyle characteristics, we can find that in the stable high-risk group people, nearly 49% were underreported as definition by the dietary misreporting analysis. And healthy weight account for the majority of the stable low and low to high groups. But nearly 83% of the participants in the stable high group people were obese. Among the laboratory biochemical indicators, the stable high group people has the highest mean level of all the biomarkers other than the AST and the HDLCs. The baseline dietary fatty acid indicator was shown in table 2 for the plausible report only, and considering the group validation of the variation in the energy requirements, the participants of the energy intake from a specific total fats, saturated fats, TOFA, and MUFA were also reported, and we can see that there's a trend of increasing for the dietary fatty intake characteristics of the baseline, which means the higher risk you got, the higher intake of these fatty acids you have in the baseline, as a baseline. And we construct 3 models. In the first model, we adjust for the total energy only. In the second model, we adjust for the dietary misreporting in addition to the model 1. And in the model 3, we adjust for the sex, computer varying, family income based on the model 2. And we can find that the saturated fatty acids plays a significant protective model for the increasing risk group, but will no longer significantly after adjusting further factors. While polyfatty acids is a risk factor for those people in a stable high-risk group people, but lost significance after further modeling. And for the omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, we can find that the very long-chain fatty acids are the significant risk factors for the people from the low to high-risk group people, which compares to the stable low-risk people as a reference group. And the total omega-6 and the ratio of the 6 and 3 are the significant factors for the people in the stable high-risk group people to the stable low-risk group as a reference group. Our study shows that the adolescence to young adults is an important period for the fatty liver disease occurrence and development. And it could be highly correlated with a high omega-6 and the ratio of the higher omega-6 and 3 fatty acid intake in the baseline diet. Our study stress is the first study who working on the study who study on the association between the dietary fatty acids and the longitudinal natural development of the fatty liver disease from adolescents to young adults. The elimination of our study is the dietary data is from the food frequency questionnaire data, but we introduced the dietary misreporting into the analysis of the covariate factor to help better statistical modeling. And also we use the energy and adjustment method to minimize the impact of the FFQ measurements error in statistical. And we do not adjust for the alcohol consumption because our outcome measurement is the FRI index. And we thanks for the Raine Study participants and all the organization and the fundings. Thanks.
Thank you, Fusen. Could you please just stop sharing your screen now? Thank you for a nice presentation. I've got, I think it's quite interesting that we're seeing in the Raine study a lot of early life behaviours are influencing health into adult life, and this is a nice example of that. And then that does lead to, you know, interventions in early life to change behaviour. I'm just wondering if there's anything around the efficacy of changing diets early in life, and what the research kind of tells around that, which might be interesting for other people looking at behaviour change around this time for other areas in the Raine study.
Well, it's a very interesting question. The dietary changing is the measurement of the diet is very difficult. We use the FFQ data to collect all this diet data, and by long, there is not significant data. The studies who working on the dietary changing during this period. Mostly, it's more easy to track the outcome changing in the early period. So I guess it's very interesting future directions for the nutrition epidemiology in the Raine study to study the tracking the dietary changing behavior in the early period.
Thank you, Pizan. That's all we have time for there. So maybe it looks like you're sharing your screen again. So if you could just stop sharing.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Now we move on to our next presentation from Dimple Patel. So Dimple is a PhD student enrolled at Curtin University. Her research focuses on early life predictors to create a prediction score of asthma and identify at-risk children as early as possible. Her project is a collaboration between Curtin University and the Telethon Kids Institute. We have, yep. So Dimple, we'll hand over to you when you're ready.
We're having issues with the video, but Dimple is going to start presenting.
Hello, thank you everyone for being patient there. Okay, so I will just here I will just present my research proposal presentation, so don't expect any result in this presentation. So it's for the personalized machine learning based prediction of asthma in children. So there is a large burden of asthma in Australia and affecting 1 in 9 Australians and associated with large cost involved for asthma. And therefore, it has been designated as a national health priority area by the Australian government. I hope everyone can see me now. Asthma is a complex disease and associated with multiple risk factors such as prenatal or familial risk factors, postnatal or environmental risk factors, and some other important risk factors such as genetics. Genetics interact with environmental risk factors to determine the pathogenesis of the disease. Although genetics has a crucial effect on the severity, development, and treatment of asthma, the role of genetics in asthma is still not completely known. Understanding these interactions may improve the early prediction of asthma, and therefore my study will include genetics as a predictors. So prediction has many advantages, and therefore there has been many studies conducted and create some tools and use different methods to predict asthma in children, such as asthma predictive index, which is based on these 5 risk factors. Later on, few researchers has tried to modify this asthma predictive index and create risk or severity score and use logistic regression models. in order to improve the prediction accuracy and add more predictors in the modeling. Two recent systematic reviews reveal that logistic regression was the most popular method among all, and it could achieve higher value for the performance measures. And therefore, my study will use logistic regression as a baseline model. However, these traditional models has many disadvantages. None of them have widely used in the clinical practice. These models has low prediction accuracy, sensitivity, and positive predictive value, and often shows modest generalizability when validated independently. Despite the prior knowledge of the multiple risk factors associated with asthma, this traditional model has used less than 10 predictors per model, and they did not address the issue of multicollinearity or interaction between variables, which may affect the performance of the prediction model. And therefore, there is a large opportunity to use machine learning models. Yep. So machine learning has many advantages. It can handle a large source of information with potential to discover the new risk factors. There is no exceptions for the relationship between predictors or outcome. And machine learning can also consider nonlinear high-order interaction between variables and provide the stable outcomes, which may improve the prediction accuracy as compared to the traditional modeling. And machine learning is also important for the personalized medicine, where the modeling is based on the personalized genotypes and phenotypes in order to get the best and cost-effective outcome for an individual. So data-driven machine learning algorithms, as name suggests, depends on the available data. And therefore, it is very important to compare different machine learning algorithms in order to get the best one for the available data. And these are the most commonly used machine learning algorithms in the asthma research. However, there are only few machine learning algorithms has been used and published to predict asthma in children, and they have many disadvantages. None of them have externally validated, which is very important information to check the reproducibility and generalizability of the model on an external cohort. They have used small sample size, which is less than 300 participants, except one, which has used administrative data set. And again, it can affect the quality and generalizability to the broader population. These models did not clarify the time points when they collected the predictors, which is very important information to know what age of the child exposed to the particular risk factors responsible to develop asthma in their later life. And they did not compare the prediction of the childhood asthma and persistent asthma, which can give us the important information about the risk factors particularly responsible for the childhood asthma and what risk factors are responsible for the persistent asthma. So my PhD will address these disadvantages. So behind the main aim of my PhD to predict asthma in children, there are multiple objectives. We will compare different machine learning algorithms in order to get the best one for my available data and to screen out the important risk factors. And we will also compare this with the baseline logistic regression model in order to check how much accuracy is improved when we use the machine learning algorithms. We will then create the prediction model for asthma at 5 years of age and then create asthma score for 14 years of age. Then we will incorporate the genetics data to the above trained model to check the role of genetics in the prediction of asthma. At the end, we will externally validate these findings in international cohorts. Now I will give you the basic concept of the machine learning and how it works. So the available data will be split into the training and test data set. We will use the training data to train the model and get the accuracy when we test it on the test data set. So this is a typical layout of the internal validation. When we use the external cohort to test the accuracy, it is called an external validation. So for this PhD, I will use the Raine Study data to train the model. And I will be using the eligible cohorts from the life cycle project as a validation cohort. So the eligibility will be based on the match risk factor to the Raine Study data set and followed up children at the target age of prediction. So particularly Danish National Birth Cohort and Generation R in Netherlands showed interest to participate in this study. And we will also use the child study, which is based in Canada, to validate these findings as well. So as I'm going to use machine learning algorithms, there is a large opportunity to use multiple risk factors at the beginning, and the machine learning algorithms itself will decide on the most important predictors to be included in the final model. So for the prediction at 5 years of age, we will include all the information collected in the Raine study for early life risk factors during pregnancy, and all the information available for the first, second, and third year of the follow-ups. And by learning from this childhood asthma prediction, we will predict asthma at 14 years of age. So the asthma diagnosis at prediction age will be defined as the doctor's diagnosis of asthma, asthma symptoms, and asthma medication used in the last 12 months. So in addition to the internal and external validation, our project will assess the quality of the final model by calculating different performance measures too. So there are a lot of significances of this project. This project will give us the deep understanding about the machine learning algorithms used in asthma research. It will also give us the important information about the early life risk factors in prediction of asthma in children. It will also uncover the interaction between genetics and environmental risk factors related to asthma. It will also help to improve the management plans for asthma in children. And the findings of this project will potentially translatable to the clinical practice. I would like to acknowledge the participants and families of the Raine study and my supervisors. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you, Dimpel. That was a really interesting study. I've got one question to start with. Now, it's really interesting to see the multi-generational and environmental risk factors posed for prediction of asthma. Do you think it might have implications for how people, for which countries or cities people choose to live in, and their family lifestyle factors, and indeed the home itself?
Yeah, I do understand that when we develop the prediction score in the Raine study, and we are going to validate in the international cohorts, there will be some genetics difference and there will be a lifestyle difference as well. But at least we can validate our findings, how it's going to behave in the international cohorts as well. And other thing is, there is no similar cohorts available in WA that I can validate with. So we are thinking just to start with the international cohorts for this PhD. And then later on, we can even validate with origin study when we have the data available.
Thank you. Dan, you get a question.
Just a quick one. Just in terms of, do you have a dissemination plan? Like once you come up with this, what would hopefully be a really robust prediction tool, what's your dissemination plan around that to get it in the hands of clinicians?
So if it's successfully and we have the successful prediction score, then it is like further on we can just develop the tool or the software that the GP clinics can use, but it is up to the funding and the technical engineer or software if available. And for the reporting, I'm going to do the stakeholder reporting as well, and using some standard checklists like a ProBust and tripod checklist as well. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. We'll be going to our next presentation now. So next we've got Dr. Jun Yang, who is going to be presenting a study on the correlation between aldosterone renin ratio and blood pressure in young adulthood, a longitudinal study. Dr. Yang is a consultant endocrinologist and early career researcher.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much to the conference organisers for this opportunity to present at my first ever Raine conference. And the amount of data is just staggering. I'm very grateful to all of my co-investigators for their input into the analysis of the data that I'm about to present. And I'm particularly grateful to Professor Laurie Bayling and Professor Trevor Morey for guiding me through this Raine data sets. Now, we all know cardiovascular disease begins in childhood, or maybe even earlier. And a key risk factor is high blood pressure, which tracks quite well from childhood to adulthood, as shown by previous studies from the Raine cohort. Now, some known determinants of high blood pressure have been clearly studied, such as the BMI, a sedentary lifestyle, or high sodium diet. But today, I'd like to show you another determinant of high blood pressure, and that is aldosterone. In adults, we know that primary aldosteronism, or the excessive production of aldosterone from the adrenal glands, is a common cause of hypertension. Aldosterone excess causes hypertension by increasing sodium retention and volume expansion. Primary aldosteronism also increases the risk of cardiovascular disease more so than just essential hypertension, and it's highly treatable using aldosterone blocking medications, or in some cases even curable with adrenal surgery. The best screening test for the condition is the aldosterone to renin ratio. Normally, aldosterone production is regulated by renin, but in primary aldosteronism, aldosterone level is inappropriately normal or high relative to a suppressed renin, and therefore the ratio is increased. Recent research has shown that aldosterone excess exists on a continuum even before blood pressure becomes elevated, and a higher aldosterone to renin ratio has been shown to be associated with increased incidence of hypertension. But these studies were all done in adults with a mean age of 40 to 60. So at what age does this continuum begin? And when does the ARR start to affect blood pressure? So the Raine study and its huge database of biological parameters from young people provides the perfect opportunity to answer these questions. And therefore, we set out to evaluate the relationship between aldosterone, renin, oh, sorry, this is on autopilot. We set out to evaluate the relationship between aldosterone, renin, and ARR and blood pressure at ages 17 and 27, and to find out if the aldorenin ratio at 17 can predict blood pressure at age 27. These are important questions because the early identification of a modifiable risk factor can lead to timely intervention. So in this analysis, we used data from the Gen 2 cohort who participated at 17 or 27 years of age. Women on hormonal contraception were excluded. As this audience is very familiar, some of the data comes from questionnaires, while others are collected at clinic visits. For this particular study, we applied for specific funding to measure serum aldosterone and renin on frozen samples. And a generalized linear model was used to examine the relationship between the ARR and blood pressure, with adjustment for several confounding factors. So after exclusion, we had 872 participants at age 17 and 758 participants at age 27. As you can see, the aldosterone to renin ratio increased over time, but was higher in females compared to males at both age 17 and 27. However, systolic blood pressure was actually lower in females than males at both ages. Now, in the males at age 17, their aldosterone ratio was positively associated with their systolic blood pressure. Indeed, those in the highest quartile of ARR had a 3.15 millimeter mercury higher systolic blood pressure than those in the lowest quartile of ARR. This relationship was not observed in the females at age 17. When the ARR was analysed as a continuous variable in a multivariate regression model, for every 10 unit increase in the ARR, there was a 1 millimeter mercury increase in systolic blood pressure. And just for perspective, a normal aldosterone-renin ratio is considered to be less than 70. So we can sometimes see aldorenin ratios of 100, 200, or even higher. So this is quite a clinically meaningful result. Curiously, the aldosterone-renin ratio at 17 in females was significantly associated with blood pressure at age 27. So after adjustment for confounding factors, we can see that at age the ARR at age 17, with each 10-unit increase, it was associated with a 1.5 millimeter mercury increase in systolic blood pressure at age 27, or a 1.4 millimeter mercury increase in diastolic blood pressure at age 27. And this association was not seen in males. And aldosterone or renin alone did not have such an association. And that's why the elder-renin ratio is a better screening test than either parameters by themselves. So in summary, there are three main findings from this study. Firstly, there are distinct age and sex differences in the elder-renin ratio. It increases with age and are higher in females at both 17 and 27, despite a lower blood pressure. It's important to consider the effect of endogenous estrogen and progesterone. In particular, progesterone is actually a potent antagonist of aldosterone function. Secondly, the aldosterone ratio correlated with systolic blood pressure at 17, only in the males but not in females. Whether it's physiologically significant is unclear because most of these ARRs actually lie within normal range, although it's possible that the normal range needs to be defined for this age group. And the correlation was not observed at 27 in males. And finally, the aldosterone ratio at 17 in females correlated with systolic and diastolic blood pressure at 27. This is a very novel finding and as yet unexplained. So an important limitation is the lack of reference to the stage of menstrual cycle because as I've alluded to before, gonadal hormones have an impact on both blood pressure and the aldosterone-renin ratio. Furthermore, we were not able to further investigate participants who had an abnormal ARR due to the retrospective nature of the study. So the number of people with truly pathological aldosterone excess is unknown in the current study. So in conclusion, we found a relationship between the aldosterone-renin ratio and blood pressure in an age and sex-dependent manner. Now, even though the blood pressure differences noted with increasing ARR was quite small, in the order of 1 to 3 millimeters of mercury, at a population level, this represents quite a significant difference in cardiovascular risk. Further analysis of the elder-renin ratio, blood pressure, and surrogate markers of cardiovascular dysfunction could further clarify how important the elder-renin ratio is as a cardiovascular risk factor in young people. And with further studies based on, hopefully, further measurements and prospective measurements of aldosterone and renin in the Raine cohort, we may come to a conclusion as to whether ARR is really a useful tool in the assessment of hypertension in young people. And I would like to thank all Raine Study participants, their families, and our specific funding bodies, and the Heart Foundation and the Rebecca Cooper Foundation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for a nice presentation there. We've got time for a quick question. So looking at your data, I hope I didn't miss this. I think you split it into quartiles at both age times. I was just wondering about the stability of membership of individuals in those quartiles across those time points. Did you look at that or, yeah? Yes,
so we assessed the tracking of ARR over age. I didn't present the data there, but those who were started off in the higher ARR group tended to remain in the higher ARR group. So that's definitely data that I should include when we publish. So that was good tracking.
Yeah, excellent. So that'll be useful for future trajectory analysis, perhaps to look at the stability or change of those measures over time. Thank you very much for a nice presentation. Maybe stop sharing.
I will stop share now. Thank you very much.
And we found out that we are at hashtag Raine Study ASM 2020 if you're on Twitter, and more generally at Raine Study on Twitter as well. Oops. So next presentation is by Amber Bainan. She's a PhD candidate at Murdoch University in WA. Her research investigated if early life illness factors are potential risk factors for low back pain in adolescence and young adulthood. I can see Amber there, so we'll hand over to you.
Thank you. All right, so thanks for that introduction. as we said. So this presentation is answering the question about, do early life chronic inflammatory conditions predict low back pain in adolescence and young adulthood? So low back pain is a leading cause of disability worldwide, and it affects people of all ages, including children. From early adolescence, low back pain is actually ranked within the top 10 causes of years lived with disability. During childhood, there's a lot of commonly occurring conditions that can commence during childhood, such as asthma, for example. In adults, respiratory illness and digestive illnesses have been linked to future low back pain. However, there hasn't been much research in this younger population to determine if inflammatory illnesses could potentially predict low back pain. So our objective was to investigate for links between early life chronic or recurrent inflammatory conditions and impactful low back pain in adolescence and young adulthood. In this longitudinal study, we used data from the Raine Study Gen 2 participants. Data were collected on inflammatory conditions from 1 to 22 years of age and impactful low back pain from 14 to 22 years of age. In terms of the inflammatory conditions, information was collected on diagnosed conditions, medications use, and hospital admissions using ICD-9 codes. We categorized the inflammatory conditions by ICD-9 categories, so that's by their diagnosis, which is basically by their systems. So we categorized them as endocrine system conditions, respiratory system conditions, digestive system conditions, skin and subcutaneous conditions, and musculoskeletal conditions. We then created further categories, not mutually exclusive to the first categories, including autoimmune conditions and atopic conditions. Autoimmune refers to an illness that occurs when the body tissue is attacked by its own immune system, such as type 1 diabetes and Addison's disease. Atopic refers to a genetic tendency to develop allergic diseases, such as allergic rhinitis, asthma, and atopic dermatitis. So the purpose of classifying in these ways was to determine if the exposures to chronic illnesses mattered whether it was within a system, like endocrine respiratory, or whether it was of the same type, such as autoimmune atopic. We then created a final category, including any chronic inflammatory conditions. So that included all of the previous. Then we included data for impactful low back pain from 14 to 22 years. So back pain was asked whether the participants had experienced back pain in the last month. And we only classified if they had an impact as well of that back pain, such as seeking treatments or missing activity, missing sport. So in the analysis, we actually had three main analyses and three main objectives to what we were doing. Firstly, we considered a cross-sectional association, so at the same point in time, for inflammatory conditions and impactful low back pain from adolescence to young adulthood. We then considered the longitudinal association, so the inflammatory conditions from childhood, 1 to 10 years of age, and impactful low back pain from 14 to 22 years. In this one, we're really trying to consider if there was a temporal relationship between the inflammatory conditions and impactful low back pain. We then considered a potential dose-response relationship in which we consider the number of chronic inflammatory conditions and the occurrences of impactful low back pain. Logistic regression models were used in all three analyses. So into the results. So from the ages of 14 to 22 years, 1,152 participants reported at least one episode of impactful low back pain. Sex was found to be a significant covariate in all models, so all these models are adjusted for sex. So for the first analysis, for the cross-sectional associations, we found that children who had musculoskeletal conditions, respiratory conditions, skin conditions, autoimmune conditions, or atopic conditions, so any of those type of conditions from 14 to 22 years had an increased odds of low back pain at that same point, 14 to 22 years. And also just participants with any chronic inflammatory condition from 14 to 22 years had an increased odds of reporting low back pain and reporting impactful low back pain. When we considered the longitudinal association, we found that the participants that had respiratory conditions, atopic conditions, or just any inflammatory condition had an increased odds of reporting low back pain. So this was when they had conditions from 1 to 10 years of age, anywhere between that, and then also whether they reported the low back pain at 14 to 22 years. When we considered the dose-response relationship, we found that participants with 2 illnesses or 3 or more illnesses had an increased odds of reporting impactful low back pain. So as we can see, that increasing odds ratios demonstrate that potential dose-response relationship. So in summary from all of those results, the most important things we found was there were longitudinal and cross-sectional associations, in particular with respiratory and atopic conditions, with impactful low back pain in adolescence and young adulthood. So the strengths of the study are the fact that we use a community-dwelling Raine Study participant data, and that we use the definition of impactful low back pain rather than merely back pain. However, some limitations include that at age 14, back pain was used rather than low back pain. So questions on back pain can obviously have a larger prevalence because that covers a larger portion of the spine. Also, some inflammatory conditions had quite a low prevalence. For example, from age 1 to 10 years of age, there were only 30 participants that were diagnosed with autoimmune conditions, compared to 1,352 participants that were diagnosed with respiratory conditions from 1 to 10 years. Because of some conditions only had a very, very low prevalence, that could lead to a type 2 error failing to reject the null hypothesis. So the results from this study showed the need to consider comorbidities in clinical practice and future research. Clinicians and researchers should consider other conditions that are potentially having a role on the musculoskeletal complaint. Musculoskeletal clinicians may ask about past and current medical history, and even though they are more non-modifiable factors, they should still be given consideration when you go through that medical history, and that may require interprofessional collaborations. So overall, again, in summary, we found that there were longitudinal and cross-sectional associations with respiratory and atopic conditions with impactful low back pain in adolescence and young adulthood. However, more evidence is needed to determine if there's a true causal relationship between the chronic inflammatory conditions and impactful low back pain, or if there's potentially a common origin for these conditions. I would like to thank the Raine Study participants and their families, the Raine Study team for cohort coordination, and the funding and core management partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber. Very nice study. We've got one question here that says, did you look to see if the effects on back pain were mediated by adiposity, which can cause chronic inflammation?
By what, sorry?
Adiposity.
Okay.
Any association with adiposity?
Yes, we did actually consider that as one of the potential covariates. We did consider a lot of other covariates, including that, but we found there was no significant relationship between in the analysis, and it also made no difference in the outcome in the end. So we only included sex in the final analysis, but we did consider that as a potential mediator and compounder.
Okay, I've got a quick second question. So as a gastroenterologist, naturally I'm interested in the digestive aspect. Did you look generally at gastrointestinal symptoms or abdominal pain?
In terms of gastrointestinal, we only looked at the diagnosed chronic conditions. So we weren't looking at specifically just symptoms of abdominal pain, but diagnosed conditions. So for example, within that would be something like a Crohn's disease.
Okay, just wondered because abdominal pain is common, clustered with somatic pain and pain sensitivity, and sometimes it or treatment of pain can result in abdominal pain as well. But otherwise, very nice study.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right, so we've got one more presentation to come.
Stop.
Yeah, that's it. Want me to do it?
Right, so we've got next Francesca Sana presenting on early life predictors of lung function trajectories in the Raine study.
You hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So today I'd like to talk about part of my PhD project that focuses on early life predictors of lung function trajectories in the Raine study. Lung development starts in utero as early as 3 weeks of embryonic life, where a number of rapid change occur and continues to childhood into early adulthood. It's become more evident that events during the intrauterine and postnatal life may be able to influence a normal lung function trajectories of an individual, and that deficits that occur during these periods may track also into adulthood. A normal lung function trajectory consists essentially in 3 phases of development. The first one is a growth phase in which lung function increase, reaching a peak around 20-25 years of age. In the second phase, we have a plateau for a few years that is followed by a lung function decline due to physiological lung aging. So, however, a complete understanding of lung function trajectories at the population level and the related early life risk factors is currently lacking. So, the aim of this study was to characterize lung function trajectories in the Raine participants from childhood to adulthood and to investigate early life predictors that were related to the low lung function trajectories that we identified. So, spirometry is a common non-invasive lung function test that measures how much air you can breathe out in one forced breath. So the 3 most important parameters measured by spirometry are FEV1, that is the volume expired after 1 second of maximal expiration, FEVC, that is the total amount of air exhaled after blowing out as much as possible, and the FEV1 and FEVC ratio. So for our analysis, we investigated 1,512 generation 2 participants that had at least 2 spirometry measurements during the years of follow-up, so during 6, 14, and 22 years of age. As we can see from the table, the proportion between male and females was almost the same in our population sample. So all the variables regarding demographic and childhood and parental risk factors were retrieved by using information provided by parents at baseline. And firstly, for our statistical analysis, we identified the trajectories using group-based trajectory modeling. That is a kind of finite mixture modeling. So this model, after having determined the optimal number of groups, assign each participant in one of the groups that we identified. So when to look at the association between trajectories and predictors, we use multivariate analysis through multinomial logistic regression. As we can see from this figure, we found 4 trajectories for FEV1, 4 for FEVC and FEV1 and FEVC ratio. And the first 2 figures are about FEV1 and FEVC, and we can see that seems to be pretty stable over time and at the similar trajectories. So we label them as very low, low, average, and above average, and the red line is the average one. If we look at FEV1 and FEVC trajectories, the shape looks different, and we label them as low, low, high, high, low, and average trajectories. So after having characterized a number of different trajectories, we look at what extent childhood and parental and childhood predictors were associated with the trajectories that we identified. So as we can see from this table, childhood asthma and asthma HEVR was associated with very low and long trajectories of FEV1. And also participants in the very low trajectory of FEV1 were also more likely to have a low respiratory tract infection during the first year of life. Participants in the low trajectories of FEVC were also more likely to have childhood wheeze, while lung function trajectories of FEV1 and FEVC were also more likely to have participants with childhood asthma or asthma HEB. Together with other risk factors, different studies have shown that air pollution is associated with lung function decline. So, however, most of the studies focus on the acute effects more than the long-term consequences. So another aim of our study was to introduce environmental predictors and see if life exposure to air pollutants were associated with the membership to be in one of the low trajectories that we identified. So what we have done is to investigate two pollutants that are NO2 and PM2.5 absorbance, and we assigned the individual early life pollution exposure for all the Raine participants. So in order to do this, we investigate the geocode. We use the geocodes based on their home addresses when the children were lived when they were between 3 and 4 years of age. We use the land use regression model that was developed for the metropolitan area of Perth in 2012. And we use the annual average concentration of PM2.5 and NO2 retrieved from the Western Australia Department of Environment. So in this way, we were able to back extrapolate data and look at the individual exposure to NO2 and PM2.5 absorbance in early life for all the participants. And as we can see from the table, here we have the early life exposure for these two pollutants, and we can see that the concentration are relatively low compared with other international countries, and are also lower than the WHO recommendation limits. In fact, when we look at the association between the early life exposure and lung function trajectories of FEV1, FEVC, and even FEV1 and FEVC ratio, we could see any association. So, in conclusion, this study highlighted a diverse group of the population that follow a persistently low lung function trajectories. And we found that early life predictors that appear to be important in determining lung function trajectories, such as childhood asthma, wheeze, and low respiratory tract infections. We didn't find any association between early life exposure to air pollution and membership to low lung function trajectories. However, we need to consider that Perth is an area with a low concentration of NO2 and PM2.5 absorbance, and so it can be worth to repeat this study in an area where the concentration are higher. And also another limitation of this study is that we were not able to back extrapolate the data in other important periods, such as pregnancy and the first 2 years of life. And so we can conclude saying that in utero life, infancy, and early childhood may be critical windows of opportunities for early prevention of long-term lung function health. I would like to thank you, the Raine Study participants and all their families, and all my supervisors. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Francesca. Very interesting presentation. I guess I was wondering about, being a physiotherapist, the effect of physical activity on lung function, and therefore, did you consider early life factors related to physical activity? Maybe there's engagement in sports in the Raine study, or is that something that you think might be important in this modelling going forward?
Yeah, actually, we know that physical activities can be a protective factor for lung function decline, but in our study, we haven't included these predictors, but maybe really important to have a look at it and know the association, if there is any association with the lung function trajectories.
Thank you. Claire, did you have any last questions on that one?
Yes, just interested to know whether there was any association with parental lung function.
Yep. So we had a look at that, and we couldn't find any association. We could see that there is a positive association, but we're not statistically significant. So we know from literature that can be a potential like risk factors, but we couldn't find in our analysis. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for a very interesting session. There's a few questions. There's one or two questions online we didn't get to. I see Andrew Klaus, who's over in Queensland, has sent one through. So please email those through to the presenters. I'm sure they'll be happy to answer them. Thank you for joining us for this session. I think we're into a lunch break for half an hour, and hopefully we'll be back without technical difficulties.
Been a number of researchers collaborating with Teresa Sullivan, who has done work in across the entire lifespan. Here we've got a picture of the bod pod where they were running a study in calcium intake in early childhood, but she's also doing work in breastfeeding and pregnancy. And this group is also looking at research all the way through to aged care and supporting healthy nutrition habits in aged care homes. We also have groups doing work in population health, so again in childhood development. But one of the areas I did want to touch on here is a researcher at our university is doing a lot of work looking at grandparents and their involvement in child development. So there's a lot of work there being done in terms of the role that grandparents play in childhood development. Finally, some of the other groups that I just wanted to touch on is the Occupational Health and Safety group. So that Occupational Health and Safety group does a lot of work in terms of toxin exposure. So they have done work in things like silicosis, asbestosis, and other toxin exposures, mainly from an environmental health perspective. They, I think, would really benefit from collaboration with clinicians in terms of the clinical aspect of that toxin exposure. They're very much involved in the environmental health, the occupational hygiene space. And the final group that I just wanted to touch on, where I do see there's the potential for some significant collaboration, again with academics involved in the Raine study, is in the exercise and physical activity space. So this picture here, we have Jodie Wilkie, that is leading a group looking at early childhood and physical activity, and particularly around the development of fundamental movement skills. So Jodie has focused her research in better understanding and better improving fundamental movement skills of children early in lifespan. And obviously, as I mentioned before, we have the exercise medicine research group, which are looking predominantly around exercise and cancer, and sports performance and injury prevention research groups. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's very clear that ECU has strengths not only in exercise and sports science, but across many of the chronic diseases which are of great interest to Raine. And it's interesting that one of the kind of focus areas of Raine study now is using this longitudinal data to create trajectories to try and predict the onset of disease. Being 30 years old, we're just starting to see the onset of chronic disease, but we haven't quite seen it yet. So I think that the value of the Raine study, if we can keep it going, just becomes exponentially more important the longer we go. Yeah. So I hope that we can engage.
Well, actually, I suppose a couple of the major research strengths across the university. One of them being in the health space, and the other one being in the securing digital futures space. And as I mentioned before, they're heavily involved in machine learning, autonomous systems, but also in data science, data analytics. And we have a lot of close collaboration between our school and their department. in looking at how we can better predict health outcomes.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, we are living in this world of big data and big data analytics and machine learning and AI. And we actually heard a couple of presentations today about how a machine learning might be used to predict who may have asthma, for example. So I think it's exciting times, and especially given that Raine, while it hasn't got the huge numbers that some of the other international cohorts has, it has density which no one else has.
Yeah. And that's, I suppose, what I want to touch on, the background I have within exercise science is that there's been this data, this sports tech revolution where we've been able to capture huge amounts of information. And we're in a similar issue where what do we do with that data? How do we actually make sense of that data?
Yes.
And really the next growth is in this data analytics space, both in the health area, but using that data that Raine has in order to better predict cancer, cardiovascular disease, or disease progression. And it's very similar to the work that's been done in sort of the sports and exercise science field as well.
Yeah. No, well, we look forward to seeing lots of project applications coming from ECU, Chris.
I'll try.
But look, thank you very much. Really appreciate you coming and talking to us. But we'll now move on to the next session, which is the last of our early career sessions. And I'll remind you that you're welcome to send in questions using the Q&A thing at the bottom of your screen, and the chairs will read out your question to the student who's presenting. And I also remind you that we haven't got Dr. Catherine Kent speaking, so we'll go a fraction slower than we would normally. But it gives me great pleasure to introduce our two co-chairs, Dr. Alexandra Metzi from Murdoch University and Associate Professor Chris Brennan-Jones from Telethon Kids Institute. So welcome, Alex and Chris.
Thanks so much, Peter, for that lovely introduction.
Stop sharing that screen. Thanks. Thanks, Peter. So our first, we've got a great early career researcher session coming up, and I think it will keep us all entertained. The first speaker is going to be Dr. Rachel Foad, and so Rachel is a NHMRC early career fellow within the Children's Lung Health team at Telethon Kids Institute. She's also an adjunct research fellow at Curtin University. Her research interests are in early life environmental exposures on chronic respiratory disease outcomes. So I'll just hand over to Rachel.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you to the Raine Study for the opportunity to present some of my preliminary results on early life daycare attendance and asthma. So asthma is a chronic, common chronic disease in childhood, which has origins in early life. And it's a classic disease of where genetics and the environment interact to influence disease risk. So one such early life environment could be the daycare environment, where some studies, so in the studies that have looked at associations so far, some have shown increased risk, and there are also studies that have shown decreased risk. And this is in line with the hygiene hypothesis, where it's supposed that if you're exposed to more bugs earlier in life, you're less likely to have allergic diseases later on. And also some studies have shown no difference whatsoever. So there's data to suggest that children who attend daycare early on also have an increased chance of getting respiratory infections, which on its own is an important risk factor for asthma, and may therefore act as a mediator for the associations between daycare and asthma. Also, many of the studies so far have focused on wheeze and asthma and outcomes. However, allergies and lung function are also important predictors for persistent asthma, and we're also interested in looking at some of the associations perhaps to daycare in this proposal. So the overall hypothesis of this study is that early life daycare attendance can lead to an increased risk for recurrent wheeze and asthma, and the specific aims were to determine if there were associations between daycare attendance in the first 3 years of life with the presence of wheeze and asthma, allergies, as well as lung function,
measured in childhood and at adolescence. And the second aim, it was to determine if respiratory infections act as a mediator for any of the associations found. So this is a study within the Life Cycle European Consortium. Some of you might recall Raine Huang talking about this a few years ago at the Raine Annual Scientific Meeting. But essentially, Raine was invited to participate with Life Cycle, which aims to harmonize data from multiple birth cohort studies across Europe to form an EU child cohort network. And this sort of just also goes to show the value of the Raine study, because it's the only Australian cohort in this consortium. So the aim is to harmonize data from across the multiple partners, and all participating groups are able to submit proposals to address research questions related to early life risk factors for chronic non-communicable diseases, of which these include cardiometabolic disease, which is led by Raine in Raine, and I work on the respiratory work package together with Graham Hall, and there's also a mental health outcome work package led by Ashley Lin, and also Monique Robinson has joined us, as well as an epigenetic arm which Phil Melton and Raine work on. So the results I am presenting today are just from the Raine study. I have approval to do it in Life Cycle, but I'm just working out some of the data access with some of the other cohorts, so I haven't quite gotten to that stage. So as I mentioned before, in order to do cross-cohort analysis, we have to harmonize all the variables in the same way. So the exposure variables I'm using is if a child attended a daycare center in the first 3 years of life, in which the Gen 2 participants in Raine had these variables collected by questionnaire at the first, second, and third year follow-ups. The outcomes were wheezing ever, which in preschool before the first 5 years of life. Asthma was defined as ever having a doctor diagnosis, and either if they had respiratory symptoms in the past 12 months or asthma medication use. We also included allergies as measured by a skin prick test, spirometry outcomes, which were measured in the Gen 2, 5, and 14-year follow-ups, and respiratory infections were also included, and these were obtained from the questionnaires in Raine from the first, second, and third year follow-ups, where it's asked if the child had any illness, and ICD-9 codes we used to record this. And we also included covariates, which were mostly demographic information, as well as potential confounding factors for the relationships between daycare and asthma. So the statistical methods used were logistic and linear regression. And if we picked up a significant association between any of the primary respiratory outcomes and respiratory infections, the plan was to then do a mediation analysis. For the results I'm presenting today, I use data for the analysis, but when it comes to working on the full project in Life Cycle, I'll be using federated analysis platform, which is DataShield, where the client is RStudio. So essentially I'll be logging in and accessing and doing the analysis on a central server. And that way I can access data on multiple cohorts without actually having to physically transfer any data across. So these are the results of the Raine study of participants. So I grouped them into those who did attend daycare and those who didn't attend daycare, of which about 2,300 participants had this data collected, as well as had respiratory outcomes. So a quick chi-square test to compare the proportions between the different groups only showed a difference in the wheeze ever group, where there was about 4% more in the group that attended daycare. And the other groups had similar proportions with all the main characteristics. So this is the result of the final multivariable models that we use. So for the wheeze ever and respiratory infection outcomes with daycare, I adjusted these for confounding factors that were found to be significant in unadjusted bivariate analysis. So the confounding factors found to be significant were maternal asthma, household income, birth weight, as well as sibling position. For current asthma and skin prick test allergy results, which were measured at 5 and 14 years, also additionally adjusted for height and weight at this age. And for the lung function Z-scores, so the Z-scores from the reference ranges actually account for height, sex, and age. So therefore, I didn't include height, weight, and sex in the adjustments. But what we can see from the main results so far, that children who attend daycare in the first 3 years of life have about a 1.4 times increase, had 1.4 times more likely to have wheeze ever in preschool compared to children who did not attend daycare. So in summary, the preliminary results so far from Raine suggest that while daycare attendance in the first 3 years of life contributes to wheeze in children, they did not appear to have any long-term risk for asthma, allergies, or lower lung function when in childhood and into adolescence. However, the plan is to do this in a broader analysis, and I think it will be interesting to see if it holds up across multiple centers and countries. So I hope to present that at some stage. So thank you. I would like to acknowledge all the Raine Study participants and the families, especially, as well as the Raine Study team for all the work they've done so far, as well as all the funding bodies who have contributed, and the team at the Teledon Kids. So if any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel, for a wonderful presentation. Just checking if anyone has any questions they might like to send through for Rachel. We're just navigating this online system, sorry, so we'll just check if anything's come through. Okay. So Rachel, I had a question. Just thank you, as I said, thank you so much. Great presentation, really interesting research and findings. I was curious about, I noticed you controlled for a number of factors in the analysis, and I was just wondering about the potential impact of birth order, and whether that was considered in the analysis plan.
So I included sibling position, which in a way includes so if you were born first, that was included, and that sort of considers birth order as well. So I adjusted for that because on its own it was associated with asthma outcomes in daycare.
Okay, great. And we've just had another question come through from Wendy, who's asked, did you adjust the duration of any breastfeeding?
No, we didn't. We have that data available, and we can potentially include that as well, but it wasn't included in this analysis. But that's something that's a good suggestion that we can add in.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much. Excellent. So for our second presentation, we have Mr. Nicholas Stafford-Bell, whose title of his presentation is 12-Year Sleep Trajectory from Childhood to Adolescence, Associations with Myopia and Ocular Biometry During Young Adulthood. So
so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for that introduction. My name is Nick, and I've been working under the supervision of Dr. Sam Lee at the Lions Eye, amongst others, on a project entitled The 12-Year Sleep Trajectory from Childhood to Adolescence, Associations with Myopia and Ocular Biometry in Young Adulthood. So for the following 8 minutes or so, I'll try to bedazzle you with my research, and we'll chat about a few different areas. First, a bit of background and rationale. So that's what everyone says. Oh, wonderful. Hopefully that's better for everyone. So we'll chat about, so firstly, a bit of background and rationale, what prompted us to do this research. So first thing we noted is that myopia, that is short-sightedness, is a very common ocular disorder worldwide, and its rates are increasing. And a publication in 2016 suggested that by the year 2050, it might be about half the world's population has myopia. So firstly, we were concerned for this reason unto itself, but also we were concerned potentially what is associated with myopia, and therefore what might also be increasing. And particularly, we noticed that myopia has been associated with sleep disturbance. And a couple of publications in around 2016 or so, published by Ayaki and G, suggested that those with worse myopia may have worse durations of sleep. So the field of this research thus far is quite limited, particularly most studies are cross-sectional, performed at single time points only. Sample sizes have been small and many studies have only looked at sleep duration rather than sleep quality assessments. Because they're single time points, the question is, does poor sleep cause myopia or does myopia cause poor sleep? Some theories presented in previous research suggest that potentially those with myopia may experience nocturnal distress when taking their glasses off at night time and therefore have difficulty going to sleep. Alternatively, those with myopia during school hours may struggle at school and therefore need to make up those hours in the evening, therefore leading to worse sleep. Other theories as to how poor sleep may cause myopia. One theory is that previously in yesteryear, children, when they couldn't go to sleep, would toss and turn or read a book, whereas now they're much more likely to look at a phone or play on the Xbox. We know that this close work is a risk factor for myopia. Another theory, a little bit more complicated, is to do with the retinal circadian clock. And the theory is that outdoor exposure regulates eye growth. And we know that outdoor exposure prevents against myopia, but there's also suspicion that this might also be circadian interplay. So worse sleep might also influence this eye growth. And of course, our major concern was that if myopia rates are increasing, so too may sleep disturbance. And as I said, that's associated with implications of its own, including cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, mental health disorders, and obesity. So as I said, our study aimed to explore the relationship between longitudinal sleep data and myopia to sort of more robustly assess this sleep myopia paradigm in a way that hasn't really been done before, including a much larger sample size. And specifically, we wanted to look at that first arm of the diagram I made, where the sleep during childhood and adolescence predisposes myopia when tested in adulthood. So using the Raine cohort, the Gen 2 cohort across years 5 to 17, at each of those follow-ups, participants guardians completed something called the child behaviour checklist, in which there's 6 questions relating to sleep disturbance, scored from 0 to 2. So a score of 2 is suggestive of worse sleep, and therefore a score of 12 out of 6 questions is suggestive of worse sleep, whereas children with scores of 0 have quite okay sleep. And then I think we've heard about group-based modelling a couple of times today, but just to sort of highlight, we use group-based trajectory modelling and using an individual scores at each time point follow-up with respect to an individual alone, but also with regards to the overall cohort. Group-based trajectory modelling puts each participant into a sleep class. So in our results, we had 793 participants, and that was those who both had the longitudinal sleep data I've just mentioned, as well as ophthalmic data when tested at the 20-year follow-up. And our data was, as discussed there, but of note, about a large proportion of our cohort was Caucasian, which is quite uncommon in the field of myopia research. So the group-based modelling produced 3 trajectories, and it said that all the participants were able to fit reasonably into one of 3 categories. Those with minimal sleep problems, we can see that their sleep scores were very low all throughout the follow-ups. Those with declining sleep problems, who had sleep problems at the beginning and then sleep problems that reduced, and the consistent or consistently troubled sleep problems. We can see that there, the participants in that group had consistently troubled sleep across the follow-ups. So next thing we did was we performed between sleep grid analysis. We said the minimal sleep group problem, the declining sleep problem group, and the consistent sleep problem group. And then we did between group analysis across those, looking at the rates of myopia and then ocular parameters such as spherical equivalence, which is a marker of refractive error, as well as axial length and corneal radius, which again are the markers of refraction. And we can see that between each group, there was no significant differences. And this is just on a basic between group analysis. As well, there were no differences in age, gender, or ethnicity in these other sort of socio-demographic comparisons. We, of course, took our data into a little bit more rigorous analysis using generalized estimating equations. And this allowed us to analyze if, again, refractive error, axial length, or corneal radius varied between these sleep groups, importantly adjusting for covariates. And we found, as I've said at the bottom there, but I'll repeat on the next slide, we found that there was no type of sleep quality in the adolescent or childhood period which preceded myopia. So it's much more likely rather that myopia causes sleep problems. And of course, I'll put a little red square over there. So as I said, the previous conflicting data in this field is likely because of the cross-sectional snapshot results, small cohorts, and potentially confounding results. And what I mean by that is that those that might have very rigorous study habits, for example, are likely to have close work in the evening, which is a risk factor for myopia, but at the same time, they're possibly under dim light and going to bed later. So they might have worse sleep. So myopia may be correlated with poor sleep, but not necessarily causative, as our study suggests. So our data is a bit limited because we use parent-reported sleep data, and we only did a single eye examination at 20 years, so we're not exactly sure when the patients became myopic. Nevertheless, our results do contribute quite a significant amount to this field of research. In particular, it's the longest sleep trajectory data in the entire field, and we fully captured that pre-myopic period, with a very, very large sample size. So we're very, very happy with that result. So just concluding on the three main findings is that poor sleep did not appear to predispose myopia, nor did good sleep protect from myopia. Nevertheless, myopia may still contribute to sleep problems, and given myopia is on the rise, the problem is still serious and should be recognised as such. And lastly, future studies should compare longitudinal sleep data both pre and then post-myopic to fully assess the paradigm. So lastly, I just wanted to pay some acknowledgements, not only to the Raine participants themselves, but the entire Raine group that's been involved with data collection and coordinating the cohorts. It's a pretty incredible effort. And as well, I'd like to thank the bodies that have been involved in financing. I've listed some down here, but specifically to the 20-year follow-up that we used for our eye examination data, including the Lions Eye, who I've worked with. So thank you, everyone, and thank you to Raine. Any questions?
Thanks, Nicholas. We're just waiting to see if any questions come through. I think it's a really interesting study, and I like the way you presented it, even though you didn't find any associations there. I was wondering, you talked about the mechanisms, and this is, I'm kind of thinking of this a bit selfishly, but so my research is in ears, and so if you're thinking there could be a relationship between sleep and potentially with eyes, even though you didn't find it in this, do you think there would be rationale for finding impacts across other senses or systems?
So can you clarify, do you mean what else might be associated with the rise in myopia?
No, I meant from the sleep perspective. If you're thinking of mechanisms that this might impact on eyes, do you think those mechanisms would exist potentially across other senses or systems as well?
Oh, I see. It's a good question. I suppose, obviously, we didn't sort of explore that. I can't really, to be honest, I can't really imagine a mechanism by which that would arise, more just because there's the sort of theories that I'm not sure, to be honest. It's a reasonable thought, but it's certainly not something that I've thought about before now.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I'm not seeing any other specific questions coming in right now, so I think you're off the hook from that. So thanks very much for that talk. It's great.
Thank you.
Okay, and so our next speaker is Dr. Gillian Tay, and she's going to be, the title of her talk is Updated Adolescent Diagnostic Criteria for Polycystic Ovary Syndrome, Impact on Prevalence and Longitudinal Body Mass Index Trajectories from Birth to Adulthood. Gillian completed her medical degree at University of Tasmania and got her endocrine fellowship from the RACP in 2018, and she's currently doing a doctorate at Monash University and with a research interest in women's health and reproductive endocrinology. So welcome, Gillian.
Polycystic ovary syndrome, or PCOS, is the most common hormone disorder in women of childbearing age, and it affects up to 8 to 13% of adult women. The two main hormone imbalance in PCOS are hyperandrogenism, which are high male hormone levels, and insulin resistance, which reduces our body's ability to regulate sugar levels. Together, these causes a wide range of health problems in PCOS, including having excessive hair growth on women's face and body, causing infertility, diabetes, risk factors for heart problems, and also poor psychological health. PCOS is extremely difficult to diagnose, and currently the most widely used diagnostic criteria is the Rotterdam criteria, which is based on three main features of PCOS. These are having irregular periods, high male hormone levels, and polycystic looking ovaries seen in ultrasound. A woman will need to have at least 2 out of these 3 features to be diagnosed with PCOS, and as a result, there are 4 possible combination phenotypes of PCOS. As for any chronic disease, early diagnosis is crucial for early treatment and prevention of the health complications. But the problem with Rotterdam criteria is that it's really best suited to diagnose adult women, but not adolescents. And the reason is because irregular periods and polycystic looking ovaries are extremely common during puberty. And therefore, using the Rotterdam criteria in teenagers will run the risk of overdiagnosing PCOS and lead to unnecessarily stress and overtreatment. In 2018, the International PCOS Guideline has suggested to update the diagnostic criteria in adolescents by stop using ultrasound assessment of the ovaries. They recommend that in adolescents, PCOS should be based solely on the presence of both irregular periods and high male hormone levels. So this will only produce one PCOS phenotype, but at the same time, exclude the 2 other phenotypes that was identified by the original adult Rotterdam criteria. It is important to note that this recommendation is really based on expert consensus rather than research evidence, because till today there is no long-term research which examines the 4 different PCOS phenotypes from adolescent years. So we don't know if these 2 excluded phenotypes will actually benefit from early diagnosis and treatment as well. Long-term weight gain is the major concern of women with PCOS because more than 60% of women with PCOS are either overweight or obese. And in PCOS, extra weight worsens the severity of the condition and is a strong indicator for long-term health problems. So in that background, the aims of our study are to compare using the updated adolescent criteria versus adult Rotterdam criteria to diagnose PCOS in a group of adolescents and see what is their difference in PCOS prevalence and see what happens to their long-term weight gain using body mass index trajectories from 0 to 22 years. We utilized data from the menstruation in teenagers sub-study where 244 females from generation 2 were recruited between 14 to 16 years old. Females who were using oral contraceptive pills and who were unable to complete their PCOS assessment were excluded in the study. All our participants then recorded a 3-month menstrual diary to assess irregular periods. They have clinical assessment of excessive hair growth and also have their male hormone profile collected to determine higher male hormone status and also have transabdominal ultrasound of their ovaries done. We will show results using both cross-sectional and longitudinal analysis of their body mass index and then show BMI change over time of the different PCOS phenotypes. In our study, we have a total of 227 females included, and we have over 1,900 BMI measurements. For each participant, they have a median number of 9 measurements throughout the 10 follow-up time points. Participants with and without PCOS have very similar social demographic backgrounds. And on the prevalence, our results show that the adult Rotterdam criteria diagnosed PCOS in nearly 30% of the adolescents. Whereas when we use the adolescent criteria, the prevalence dropped to 16%, and this is much closer to the estimated prevalence in adults, which is 8 to 13% shown in other studies. In cross-sectional analysis of the BMI, we show that females with adult Rotterdam criteria PCOS have significantly higher BMI than those without PCOS starting from age 14. But when we use the adolescent criteria, the difference occurs much earlier in childhood from age 5 onwards. We find very similar results in our longitudinal analysis where females with adult criteria PCOS showed higher BMI gain than those without PCOS from age 14, but the adolescent criteria showed the difference from age 10. This is before they start to menstruate, which is around 15 years old age of menarche in our study population. Lastly, we are interested to know if the two phenotypes that were excluded by the new adolescent criteria and see if they're different from participants without PCOS. Because if they show that the BMI trajectories are different, this means that they may benefit from earlier diagnosis and treatment. This figure shows the predicted lines of BMI change over time, where red represents the participants who were identified with PCOS using the adolescent criteria, and green line represents those without PCOS. When we plotted in the blue and purple line, which represents the two excluded phenotypes from the adult Rotterdam criteria, we see that they actually have the exact same BMI trajectory as those without PCOS. Our study is really the first of its kind because previous studies which look at long-term weight gain in PCOS have used population where PCOS was diagnosed in adulthood, and they've also used population from hospital or clinical setting. Otherwise, they relied on self-reported PCOS diagnosis and self-reported BMI. No previous study was really able to differentiate the long-term outcomes of the 4 different PCOS phenotypes. Whereas in our study, our participants are from the general population, we have very detailed PCOS assessment and very well characterized phenotypes, and all the BMI measurements were standardized. We do recognize that the majority of our study population is Caucasian, so our results may not be generalizable to other ethnicities and race. And also there is no clear cutoff for male hormone levels in adolescents. So in our study, we have used an arbitrary cutoff to be the top 25th percentile in this group. Lastly, we use transabdominal ultrasound to look at the ovaries when we know that transvaginal ultrasound is considered the gold standard and more accurate. But transvaginal ultrasound would not be appropriate in this age group because most of them will not be sexually active yet. In conclusion, adolescent criteria reduces overdiagnosing PCOS by half compared to traditional adult Rotterdam criteria in adolescents. And more importantly, this criteria accurately identify the group which is at risk of long-term weight gain. And so this is the group that clinicians should target for early diagnosis and treatment. PCOS can only be diagnosed after female starts to menstruate to assess irregular periods. But we now show that weight gain in PCOS occurs before they start to menstruate. So this implies that metabolic health problems in PCOS may begin pre-pubertally. And overall, our results provide evidence that validates the PCOS guideline to use adolescent criteria and omit ultrasound assessment of the ovaries to diagnose PCOS. I'd like to express my gratitude to my supervisors, collaborators, and funding, and of course, our Raine Study participants, families, and all the institutions that have helped to fund and support the Raine Study. And that's it, thank you.
Great, thank you so much for a great presentation, Gillian. Just having a bit of a look to see if there's been any questions that have been sent through.
Not yet, but fire them through.
Not yet, yeah, so fire them through if you have any. I did have a question, Gillian. Just, I think it's really excellent research, and how wonderful that we have that specificity to be able to notice and screen really early on for PCOS, and then obviously be able to intervene to support around some of the conditions that tend to come with that diagnosis. I guess I was just being curious, sort of from a psychological perspective, key considerations around sending messages to really young kids that might have an endogenous predisposition for weight gain, what that might do for their sort of sense of self, etc. So I'm just curious about, I think there's excellent clinical utility, but just curious around if you guys have given any thought to the type or style of messaging that you might use to be able to intervene in a preventative way from such a young age.
Actually, we know that PCOS runs in the family. So if you have a mother or sister or aunt who's got PCOS, you're at risk of getting PCOS. And certainly when we have discussed with other researchers who has been following women with PCOS for a very long time, they have shown that those women with PCOS, what they really want to know is early diagnosis, and they want to know if their offsprings are at risk. So they really want to know, are my children at risk and how can I do to prevent it? Currently, research has been shown that PCOS is severely underdiagnosed. It's estimated that 70% of women with PCOS remains undiagnosed worldwide. And women who have been diagnosed reported that more than 2/3 of them require more than 2 years to be diagnosed and see multiple specialties.
We're getting a little bit of breaking up.
Diagnosing them accurately is the most important thing that we should. At the moment, women really likes to be diagnosed early, and 2/3 of them has spent more than 2 years seeing multiple doctors before they get diagnosed.
Great. So, sorry, Julie, I think we're getting a little bit of breaking up here, but thank you so much for giving such a comprehensive answer to that question. We've had another one come through from Laurie Bennett, who's asked, could there be selection bias for participants who thought they had a menstrual problem?
I think the initial invitation went to over 700 participants, and of the 270 something that replied, and then they were assessed. It could be because, as we mentioned before, women with PCOS, PCOS tends to run in the family, but overall our participants is chosen from the general population rather than other studies which have chosen from the clinical setting. So ours would be the most generalizable, I think.
Great. Great. Well, thank you so much for that, Gillian. Really, really great presentation. Great work. So we're gonna move on to our next presenter, Dr. Samantha Lee, who the title of her presentation is Associations Between 7-Year C-reactive Protein Trajectory and Choroidal Thickness in Young Adults.
My name is Sam, and my presentation is on the 7-year C-reactive protein trajectory and choroidal thickness in young adults. First, a quick introduction to the eye. On the left-hand side there is a cross-sectional view of the eye. So it's what you'll see if you cut the eye in half and view it from the side. So light enters the eye through the cornea and the lens and eventually falls on the retina. And on the right-hand side there is a very magnified view of the retina. Now on the retina, you'll see a rather thick white band, which I now highlight in yellow. Now those are the photoreceptors. They're the light-sensitive cells in the back of the eye that are responsible for capturing light information as they enter the eye. And directly at the back of the photoreceptors, you'll see a very thick, squishy, spongy layer, which I now highlight in red. That is the choroid. Now, at the very center of the retina, you'll see a dip there. That is the fovea. That's the part of the eye that's responsible for very high definition vision. So when we get you to read down the letters on a letter chart and you get to those really, really tiny letters during an eye test, that's the part of the eye that you're using. Now the choroid is the vascular layer that supplies blood and nutrients to and remove waste products from the photoreceptors at the back of the eye, including those at the fovea. Now, because it has such an important role to play in the eye, studies have found that thicker choroids is associated with better vision. We have actually also demonstrated that in Gen 2 participants of the Raine study. And because of the high volume of blood flow that goes through the choroid, it makes that structure rather susceptible to inflammation. Now, the thing about inflammatory or autoimmune diseases is that when it affects someone, it tends to affect them for a really long time, and many different organs in the body is affected, often including the eye. You'll notice the other interesting thing about inflammatory diseases is that they tend to have very long and convoluted names that are hard to pronounce, like the ones I've listed over there. During the active stage of a disease, there is an increase in blood activity, and we believe that that results in a thickening of the choroid. But when that happens over and over again, there is a prolonged lack of oxygen and cell and tissue death. So the choroid seems to undergo some sort of fatigue eventually, and leading to a thinning of the choroid during the inactive phase of the disease. In individuals with inflammatory or autoimmune diseases, these changes to the choroid have been noted, even when their eye did not seem to be affected by the condition. I'll quickly touch on C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory marker produced by the liver in response to inflammation and tissue damage. elevated CRP levels have been associated with several diseases, mainly cardiovascular diseases, but also eye diseases, such as age-related macular degeneration, which is one of the leading causes of blindness worldwide. It can also be affected by your genetics, your lifestyle, and pregnancy. In healthy young adults, such as the ones in Gen 2 of the Raine study, I would expect the CRP levels to be no more than 3 milligrams per liter in their blood. So the aim of this study was to explore whether long-term levels of CRP, which is indicative of inflammation, may be associated with choroidal thickness in young adults. We included Gen 2 participants in our study, and I'm sure we're all very familiar with what we've been through all over the years. We took a lot of their bloods, and at the 14, 17, and 20-year visits, the CRP levels in the blood were measured from the samples. And at the 20 and 28-year follow-ups, a comprehensive eye examination was conducted. Now, for this analysis, we'll just use the data collected at the 20-year follow-up, the eye data collected. Participants were classified according to the 7-year CRP level and change using group-based trajectory modeling, and 3 groups were identified from the models. About 11% of participants had increasing CRP levels over the 7-year period. Another 11% had consistently high levels, while the vast majority, 78%, had consistently low levels, and that last group there was used as the reference group. The choroid was imaged using spectral domain optical coherence tomography. In that middle picture, that is a straight-on view of the retina. So it's what you'll see if you look directly through the pupil to look at the retina. And at the very center, I indicated there again, that is the fovea. So the choroid was measured at the central 1 mm circle of the retina, which includes the fovea, at the inner 3 mm ring, and at the outer 6 mm ring, as well as at the top, bottom, left, and right quadrant. So a total of 9 regions were measured for the choroidal thickness. And after excluding participants who had no choroidal thickness measurements or no trajectory data available, more than 600 eyes of 341 participants were included in this analysis. And this was what we found. On the left-hand side there, it's just a grid showing the 9 regions measured, comparing those with increasing CRP levels to those with consistently low levels. Where I indicated N as that, it simply means that the difference in choroidal thickness is not significantly different between groups. So the choroid is thinner in 6 out of the 9 regions measured there, in those with increasing CRP levels compared to those with consistently low levels. In the central region, which is the part we're most interested in, the choroid is thinner by about 21 microns. On the right-hand side there, you'll see that in 5 out of the 9 regions measured, the choroid was thinner in those with consistently high levels compared to those with consistently low levels. In the central region itself, it was thinner by about 15 microns. Now, when I tell you that the difference in choroidal thickness is 15 or 21 microns, it probably don't mean much to you. It certainly didn't mean anything to me when I did this analysis. So let's compare it to aging. If somebody ages by 5 years, I would expect the choroids to be thinner by about 7 to 21 microns. But if they had consistently high or increasing CRP levels over the previous 7 years, the choroids were thinned by a further 15 to 21 microns. So having high CRP levels ages your choroid, in other words, or maybe even worse, or even more than 5 years of aging. So this tells us that chronic subclinical inflammation is associated with thinner choroids, and this effect could be observed even in young adulthood. And why do we care about this? As I mentioned before, thicker choroids is associated with better vision. In fact, if you flip it the other way around, thinner choroids have been linked with several eye diseases in old age. So some scientists have suggested that the choroidal thickness could be predictive of future visual impairment, and maybe CRP could be as well. And that is what we hope to look at in future analyses. We want to look at, the 14-year CRP trajectory in the Raine study between the 14 and 27-year follow-ups, and how it's associated with eye measures at the 28-year follow-up. We want to know if there's any associations between CRP and future eye disease. But of course, to do that, we need to wait very long until the Gen 2 participants are much, much older. and whether there's any genetic link between CRP levels and eye disease. So with that, I end my presentation. I'd like to thank the Raine Study participants and their family and the staff, a whole lot of people to thank there, all the funding bodies, and all of you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions from here on. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sam. So we've got one question that's come through from Laurie Berlin, which is that the CRP is strongly related to BMI and other measures of fatness and insulin sensitivity. Did you look for effects of BMI?
So the analysis was corrected for BMI. BMI itself, it has no association with choroidal thickness or any other eye measures that I found. Blood pressure, there is a little bit, but even after correcting for all of these covariates and potential confounding factors, I didn't find that it affected the results at all.
Okay, great. And I had a question, which was, you talked about the number of eyes that you saw the thinning on and the number of participants. Is it something that tends to happen to both eyes, like bilaterally at the same time, or do you ever get sort of unilateral thinning? And how did you count those participants? Did they count it as a case if it was just one eye, or did it tend to happen both eyes?
So I used both eyes in my analyses. I didn't mention it in my slides, but I do correct for that in my statistical analyses. So I use generalized estimating equations with an exchangeable correlation structure, which accounts for that within subject correlation between the two eyes. I can't tell if one eye is affected or both eyes are affected at the same time. I suspect if it's both eyes because it's a whole systemic thing after all. Yeah, I can't comprehend a situation really where only one eye is affected, but it is more likely than not that one eye is more affected than the other eye.
Okay, awesome. I don't think there's any more questions, so thanks for that great talk, Sam. It's really good.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so our next speaker is Professor Jiang Hong Lee. She'll be talking to us. So Professor Lee is a senior scientist at the WZB Berlin Social Science Center, adjunct professor at the Bankwest Curtin Economics Center, and an honorary research associate at Telethon Kids Institute. She's going to be talking to us about parents' non-standard work schedules and adolescent social and emotional well-being, evidence from the Raine Study. Thanks.
Yes, hello, can you hear me? Yeah, okay.
Yep.
So I should show my slides. Can you see the slides?
Just waiting for them to come up. Not yet.
Okay, I should do this.
Just give it a second. I think I just.
Now, can you see those? Yes?
We can't see them yet, I don't think.
No, we can't see them yet.
Why is that? Because
Can you share your screen?
Yes, I just I allow share my screen, but I don't know why it doesn't show up. Yeah, I don't know then.
Is it saying that it's trying to share, Professor Lee?
But I did send my slides to the Raine Study, whether they could.
All right, we'll try and get your slides up.
We'll try and navigate from this end.
Fill it in.
She's not sharing.
Oh, okay. Great.
Okay.
We can see them now.
Got them. If you
Can
just
you see now?
Yeah, and if you just go to presentation mode, it should all come up.
Yeah, okay, good.
Great.
Yep.
Okay.
Got it.
Okay, so the 24-hour, 7-day economy refers to work hours that fall outside the standard schedule. That is from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday, Monday through Friday. Well, I don't have time to talk about why, what driving forces for this economy is. We know that the intensive use of information and communication technology, which enable globalized production, distribution of goods and services. And also there's growth in the service sector. And another important factor is labor deregulation. So there is intensive evidence that shows that working non-standard work schedule, especially evening and night shifts, is detrimental to workers' health, and there's plenty of evidence for that. There's also increasing evidence suggesting or showing that this impact actually extends to the physical and the mental health of children and adolescents whose parents work non-standard schedule. So previous studies that have specifically focused on parents' non-standard schedules and the children, adolescent children, they found that there's a high risk for depression in 14-year-olds, and that's associated with cumulative exposure to mother's night and father's evening work schedule in the US. And it shows that the number of years mothers work night shifts was linked to adolescent smoking, drinking, drug use, and delinquency in sexual activity, early onset of sexual activity in the US. And single parents' non-standard schedule has a negative impact on adolescent children's mental health, which is what we found with Mike Dockery in Australia. So very few studies have looked at the joint non-standard schedule for fathers and mothers, which focus. Very few of studies that have done, and among the studies, the focus is on young children. So why joint the parental non-standard work schedule important? Because with increasing economic uncertainty, along with improvements in labor market for women, the pressure for both parents to work will continue. And the joint work schedules take into account the interdependence between both parents' work arrangements. And also the degree to which work schedule of parents, of dual earner families overlap has important implication for, parental relationship and also division of labor within the home, and also parents' participation in children's activity. We believe that all of this influence child outcomes. So the aim of our study is to look at the impact of joint parental non-standard schedule on adolescent social emotional well-being in the Raine Study cohort. So we could only analyze one wave of the data, which is collected at ages 16, 17, because the information on parents' work schedule was only collected at this follow-up. And we use the earlier wave data as a post-hoc analysis. So the method is quite standard, multivariate linear regressions. But what we did, a bit deeper is we look at the mediation. We test the effect of, hypothesized mediators such as parents' mental health and the times parents spend with children. So social emotional well-being is measured with child CBCL scores, and we analyze both the total morbidity, and also subdomains of externalizing, internalizing, and anxiety and depression scores. So the main predictor is different categories of joint work schedules. For example, both parents work a regular or standard day schedule, which is the reference group, and then compared to both parents work evening or night or irregular shifts. or only fathers work in the evening night, but mother works standard shift, or the other way around. So category joint work schedule. We also look at, we were worried about power, because the subsample size can be quite small when we look at 5 different categories of non-standard schedule. Therefore, we also look at a simple dichotomy, whether or not any parent work non-standard schedule compared to neither parents work non-standard schedule. Okay, so control variables, family SES, demographic variables, health behavior, health behavior, for example, childbirth and BMI, and anybody smoke or use other substance in the household. Mediator, as I mentioned, parental, both father and mother's mental health, the time parents spent with adolescent children, and also parenting style. Okay, so in this first table, we show that when we analyze parents' joint work schedule as dichotomy, we see a consistent positive effect, positive association between working in a non-standard work schedule with increased risk for total and also internalizing behavior, and also anxiety, depression. And when we, look at interactions, look at 5 different categories of non-standard work schedule, we see that when both parents work non-standard schedules, there is a marginal, still positive, but a marginal significant effect. But fathers and also mothers work non-standard schedule has significant, effect on total morbidity scores. And we control for a number of other variables. And interestingly, mothers' working hours also is associated with increased risk for total morbidity. And now when we, broke down to look at the subdomains, so we see that fathers working non-standard schedule is associated increased higher score for externalizing behaviors, and the father's work hours also matters. And internalizing behavior, and again, father's non-standard work schedule is associated increased higher score for internalizing behavior. And I don't know, boys are less likely to, report to experience internalizing behavior. For anxiety and depression, and it is mother's evening and night schedule that matters. So in terms of mediation, so we tested the 3 mediators. One is both parents' mental health. The other is time parents spend with adolescent children. The third is parenting style. So what we found here is only inconsistent parenting style to some extent mediate the effect of father's evening and night irregular shifts on adolescents' total CBCS scores. So you can see it here. So inconsistent parenting itself is also associated with increased scores of total morbidity. Okay, so we have also looked at possible gender interactions. For example, fathers' non-standard schedules may have a larger effect on sons' mental health than on daughters. Also, mother's schedule, non-standard schedule, may bear stronger association with daughters' mental health than with sons. We did look at this, but we didn't find any significant interactions. And I must comment on when both parents, mother and father, work non-standard schedule, and we found the effect in the same direction as we hypothesized, but it's not significantly at the normal p-value. So we believe that the sample size is too small because we only have 11% of parents in that category. So models based on adolescent reported CBCS scores, we did the same analysis using the scores reported by adolescents, and we did not find significant effects of parent work schedule on their CBCS scores. And we look at distributions and of parents reported CBCS scores and adolescents reported scores, and we found that they seem to show different level and type of problems. The distribution is much more skewed in parents reported scores, but much less so, or kind of normal, or the distribution goes more toward more serious, end of the each total score and each domain score. So we believe it's something about type of problems parents and children, adolescent children report. And okay, limitation, obviously this is just a cross-sectional analysis. So even though we're just for a range of socioeconomic demographic variables, also health variables, to reduce possible selection effects, we still can't make a causal inference. So the question is then, is there a reverse causality that is children's health, social emotional problems might cause parents work night or evening schedules. So we did some further analysis, and this is unlikely according to our further analysis. So having one or both parents working non-standard schedule, it is associated with higher CBCS scores in all domains. And the overlap of mothers and fathers non-standard schedule warrants further investigation, maybe with a larger sample size that would give us more statistical power. So our findings highlight the importance of joint work schedule in dual earner families. It also highlights the fact that fathers' non-standard work schedule play a very important role in adolescent children's social emotional well-being. So yeah, this is we need in the future really pay attention to this. It's not just mothers but also fathers. Important to understand work-family interface, work-family balance, or work-family conflict, and how that impact on adolescent children's social emotional well-being. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee, for that excellent presentation. Some really, really relevant findings with the current work schedules and changes that are very pertinent and prevalent in society today. Unfortunately, we're just at time, so we might not have space to field any questions, but if you do have any questions for Professor Lee, please send them through and we can pass them on and hopefully get back to you via email. So that concludes the last session, the third session for today. So thank you so much for all of the presenters, and we might just hand over to Professor Eastwood to the next bit. Yes.
Thank you very much, Chris and Alex, for chairing that last session. 16 ECR presentations. We had a group of helpers who have been judging every presentation based on a set of predetermined criteria. And we again have a very generous offer from the Raine Medical Research Foundation to provide 2 awards for the best presentations. The Raine Medical Research Foundation, along with Women's and Infants Research Foundation, Telethon Kids Institute, and all the universities in Western Australia are all financial partners of the Raine Study. So it's a truly unique cross Western Australia organisation, the Raine Study. But right now we're doing the presentations of the 2 best awards, and I'll ask Amanda Cleaver, who's the CEO of the Raine Medical Research Foundation, to come and announce those presentations and award them.
Hi everyone, and thanks Peter. So first of all, I'd like to just congratulate all of the speakers from today's meeting. You've had a few extra challenges thrown at you this year, and I think you've all done extremely well to adapt and to present great quality research at today's meeting. The Raine Medical Research Foundation has been around for over 60 years, and we take great pride in the fact that we support medical research in Western Australia, and particularly early career researchers, and we are doing everything we can to ensure that we can increase our support going forward. So I'm presenting 2 awards today, as Peter said, $750 each for the best ECR oral presentation, and the first award goes to Dr. Gillian Tay, who is from Monash University, and I believe she's not here today. And then the second award is for Dr. Samantha Lee from the Lion's Eye Institute.
I believe Samantha is here. So
okay, so Samantha's actually here.
Well done, Sam. Yeah. This way.
I'll stand on the other side. Congratulations. Well done on your presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll just pass back to Peter. Thanks.
Well, you don't see that very often, do you? Live presentations these days. So congratulations to both of the presenters. Just quickly, I'm just going to wind up the meeting today. And I just wanted to acknowledge the contribution of the Unincorporated Joint Venture Board. We've had several members have farewelled us this year, including Robin Owens from UWA, Graham Hall, Telethon, Kiz, Margaret Jones, ECU, and Greg Blatch from University of Notre Dame. And they've been replaced by Tim Colmer, Paul Watt, Teresa O'Sullivan, and Gervais Cheney. So you can see that these are people at the highest levels of their institution. So the Raine Study has enormous support across the board from the institutions, both research institutions and research institutes across Western Australia. I also wanted to acknowledge those people who departed this over the last 12 months. Leon Straker, Scientific Director, has held that role for about 6 years, and Anne Smith, who held the interim Scientific Director role. Both of them had an enormous contribution, particularly Leon over many years, and I've really enjoyed working with him. We're in the process of calling for an expression of interest for a new Scientific Director across all the institutions in Western Australia, so we're hoping to be able to identify someone to interview candidates in a few weeks' time. As for myself, I've been offered and accepted a position as the Director of the Flinders Health and Medical Research Institute in South Australia. So I'll be leaving, but I did want to say thank you to a couple of people. The board are fantastic. I've mentioned them already. I'd like to acknowledge the many, many researchers who I've interacted with over the past 6 years in my position as Director of the Raine Study. And first and foremost, I'd like to secondly, I'd like to acknowledge the Raine staff who obviously put on today, but also have kept the Raine Study going for many, many years with enormous professionalism, dedication, and they are a unique team. And I think this is part of the reason why the Raine Study is as successful as it is. But finally, I just want to kind of acknowledge the participants of the Raine Study, and that's across all generations, because the Raine Study won't exist unless we have the kind of buy-in and support and engagement from all of the Raine participants. So thank you all very much. And I'm really pleased to announce that Professor Romola Bucks will be taking over from me next Monday, as the new Raine Study Director. So Romola was a head of school of psychological science here at UWA for a few years. And most recently was the Deputy Dean of Faculty of Science. She's a card-carrying researcher. She's a neuropsychologist, and I think she'll do a fantastic job as the new director. So welcome, Romola.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Peter, for that very wonderful welcome. It's an absolute pleasure to be taking over the Raine Study at this time. I wanted to say to Peter in particular, how impressed I am with the way the Raine is organised, with the wonderful staff. Today has been a tour de force and an example of the teamwork and the dedication of this group. And I am delighted to be taking over from him, and he's going to be a very, very hard act to follow. So please join me in thanking Peter Eastwood for all of his hard work in the last 6 years. Peter, you need to come and finish.
Thanks, Romola. I'm very happy to close this first ever and hopefully last virtual scientific meeting for the Raine study. Hopefully we'll see you all face to face next year. Thanks very much, everyone, and goodbye.